Welcome, true believers, to a journey through the dark and twisted cosmos of Marvel's most enigmatic alien species. Tonight, we explore the complete saga of the symbiotes, from their primordial origins in the void before existence itself, through their transformation into Earth's most complex anti-heroes and villains. This is a tale that spans cosmic eons, dimensional barriers, and the very fabric of reality. So settle into the shadows, let your mind drift into the living darkness, and allow yourself to be enveloped by the story that begins not with Spider-Man's black suit, but with the birth of the universe itself. In the beginning, there was nothing but the endless void, a primordial darkness so complete and absolute that it defied comprehension. This was not merely the absence of light, but the absence of existence itself, a realm where concepts like time, space, and matter held no meaning. Within this infinite nothingness dwelt a singular entity, ancient beyond measure and terrible in his solitude. His name was Knull, and he was perfectly content to drift through eternity in the embrace of his dark domain. Knull existed as the god of the void, a being whose very essence was intertwined with the concept of primordial darkness. He had no need for companionship, no desire for change or growth, no ambition beyond the simple pleasure of existing in perfect, unbroken silence. The darkness was his kingdom, his sanctuary, his eternal home, and he was its sole and unchallenged ruler. For eons beyond counting, he floated through the abyss, dreaming dreams of nothingness, and finding in that emptiness a peace that was absolute. But peace, as all things in the cosmos, was not destined to endure forever. Far beyond the boundaries of Knull's dark realm, cosmic forces were stirring, preparing to shatter the tranquility of the void with the violent birth of a new reality. The Celestials, those towering cosmic architects who had already witnessed the rise and fall of multiple universes, were preparing to begin their greatest work yet. They had learned from the mistakes of previous realities, had refined their understanding of creation and destruction, and were ready to craft a universe that might finally prove stable and enduring. The cosmic hierarchy that governed existence was complex beyond mortal understanding, built on a system of checks and balances that had evolved through multiple universal cycles. At its heart stood three primary forces, each serving a crucial role in maintaining the delicate equilibrium between creation and entropy. The Celestials served as the agents of change and evolution, beings of immense power whose experiments and manipulations drove the development of life and consciousness throughout reality. Opposing them from beyond the boundaries of existence itself were the Kings in White, those beings who had once been known as the Omegas before their exile to the spaces between realities. These entities, also called the Beyonders or the Ivory Kings, possessed the unique perspective that came from existing outside of creation itself. They could observe the grand patterns of existence with perfect clarity, seeing the long-term consequences of actions and the subtle interconnections that bound all things together. But the cosmic balance required a third element, a force that could work from within reality itself to maintain stability and order. This role belonged to the King in Black, a singular entity who would serve as the internal guardian of existence, using the power of living darkness to preserve the universe from threats that might arise from within its own boundaries. The living abyss that served as the King in Black's tool was not evil in itself, but rather a primordial force of preservation and protection, darkness that could nurture and shield rather than corrupt and destroy. When the Celestials finally erupted into Knull's peaceful void, their arrival was like the detonation of a cosmic bomb. Brilliant light blazed forth in all directions, shattering the eternal silence with the thunderous roar of creation itself. Stars ignited in vast cascades of nuclear fire, planets condensed from swirling clouds of cosmic dust, and the fundamental forces of physics began to assert their dominion over what had once been perfect emptiness. The invasion of light into his dark sanctuary filled Kunal with a rage so pure and terrible that it seemed to burn like a second sun in the heart of the void. The Celestials, in their cosmic wisdom, or perhaps their cosmic arrogance, barely noticed the presence of the angry god floating in the darkness they had just illuminated. To them, Kunal was simply another aspect of the reality they were creating, a useful tool that could be shaped to serve their greater purpose. They appointed him as the new king in black with casual indifference, bestowing upon him the power to control and direct the living abyss that would serve as his instrument of cosmic preservation. Under normal circumstances, such an appointment might have been received with gratitude or at least acceptance. The role of King in Black was one of tremendous honor and responsibility, offering the chance to serve as one of the fundamental guardians of existence itself. The living abyss that came with the position was a force of incredible potential, capable of creating and nurturing life just as easily as it could destroy and corrupt. But Kunal was not interested in their cosmic hierarchy or their grand designs for universal stability. The Dark God's response to his appointment was immediate and violent. Using the very power they had just granted him, Kunal reached into the heart of the living abyss and began to shape it according to his own will. The darkness responded to his rage and his hatred, twisting itself into new forms that had never existed before. In that moment of perfect fury, with the light of the newly created stars burning in his ancient eyes, Kunal performed an act of creation that would echo through the cosmos for billions of years to come. He forged his own shadow into a blade. This was not merely a metaphorical transformation, but a literal act of cosmic craftsmanship that defied the normal laws of reality. Kunal was the only thing in existence that could cast a shadow in those first moments of creation, the only point of darkness substantial enough to block the blazing light of the Celestials. Using the power of the living abyss and the force of his unbridled rage, he gave that shadow weight and substance, sharpened it into an edge that could cut through the very fabric of existence itself. All black, the Necrosword was born in that moment of divine wrath, the first symbiote ever created and the most terrible weapon the universe had ever known. The blade was not simply a tool of destruction, but a living extension of Kunal's own consciousness, possessed of its own dark intelligence and hunger for cosmic devastation. It sang with the voice of the void as it cut through the air, eager to taste the blood of gods and the essence of creation itself. With this weapon of living darkness in his hand, Kunal struck out at the nearest celestial, his blade moving with speed that transcended time and space. The cosmic being, ancient beyond mortal comprehension and possessed of power that could reshape galaxies, was caught completely off guard. The Necrosword sliced through armor that had withstood the birth and death of universes, cutting deep into flesh that had been forged in the heart of creation itself. In one perfect stroke, Kunal separated the Celestial's head from its shoulders, achieving something that had never been accomplished before in the history of the cosmos. The decapitation of the Celestial sent shockwaves throughout the newly created reality, announcing to all who could perceive such things that a new force of unimaginable darkness had been unleashed upon the universe. The severed head tumbled through space, its cosmic energy slowly bleeding away into the void, while its massive body collapsed into the stellar debris that would eventually form the foundation of countless worlds. But Kunal was not finished with his first victim. The Dark God seized the Celestial's severed head and transformed it into something even more terrible than a mere trophy. Using techniques that combined cosmic blacksmithing with primordial sorcery, he hollowed out the skull and converted it into a forge, a workshop where he could refine and perfect his mastery over the living abyss. The heat generated by the dying Celestial's cosmic energies provided the perfect environment for forging darkness into new and more sophisticated forms. Within this grisly workshop, Kunal began to experiment with the true potential of the living abyss. He improved all black, giving it greater sentience and more refined killing capabilities. He created armor for himself from the same dark matter, protection that would shield him from the retribution he knew would come. Most importantly, he began to envision larger projects, constructions that would serve as bases of operations for the cosmic war he intended to wage against the light. The first and greatest of these constructions was a planet-sized structure built entirely from living darkness, a mobile fortress that would serve as both his throne and his weapon. This dark world, crafted from the same primordial forces that had given birth to All Black, became the seat of Knul's growing power and the launching point for his campaign of cosmic conquest. From its shadow-wreathed surface, he could coordinate attacks across multiple star systems while remaining protected by layers of living darkness that could adapt and respond to any threat. But even as he reveled in his first victory and planned for greater conquests, Knul discovered that his triumph had been observed by powers far greater than any single celestial. The cosmic hierarchy that governed existence was not so easily disrupted, and the remaining celestials quickly moved to contain the threat he represented. Though he was strong enough to kill one of their number, he was nowhere near powerful enough to stand against their combined might when they worked in unison. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Knul fought with all the fury of a god scorned, wielding All Black with deadly precision and calling upon reserves of power that seemed to draw from the very foundations of darkness itself. But the Celestials had the advantage of numbers, experience, and most importantly, the cosmic authority that came from their role as the architects of reality. They could not kill him outright, for he was now the king in black, and therefore essential to the cosmic balance they were trying to establish. Instead, they chose exile as his punishment. With power that dwarfed even his considerable abilities, the Celestials cast Knul out to the very edges of the newly created universe, hurling him so far from the centers of light and life that he would be unable to interfere with their work for eons to come. They left him with his weapon and his rage, but stripped him of any means to quickly return to threaten their grand design. In the cold depths of space, surrounded by the dim light of distant stars, Knul found himself alone with his hatred and his dreams of cosmic vengeance. But the Dark God was not one to accept defeat with grace or resignation. The exile that the Celestials intended as punishment became instead an opportunity for preparation and planning. In the vast emptiness between galaxies, Knul had all the time and space he needed to perfect his mastery over the living abyss and to develop new strategies for his eventual return to power. He began to see his banishment not as an ending, but as the first phase of a much longer and more sophisticated campaign. The creation of All Black had taught him valuable lessons about the potential of living darkness as a tool of war and conquest. The sword was powerful beyond measure, but it was also singular, limited by the fact that it could only be in one place at one time. If he was to wage war against the combined might of the cosmic hierarchy, he would need weapons that could multiply, spread, and adapt to countless different battlefield conditions. He would need an army that shared his hatred of the light and his commitment to the restoration of primordial darkness. In the depths of his cosmic exile, Knul began his second great work of creation. Using All Black as both template and forge, he began crafting new forms of living darkness, creatures that would serve as extensions of his will while possessing enough independence to think and act on their own. These early experiments were crude by the standards he would later achieve, little more than animate shadows that could strike from darkness and fade away before retaliation could be organized. But they were a beginning, the first steps toward the creation of an army unlike anything the universe had ever seen. As his skills improved and his understanding of the living abyss deepened, Knul's creations became more sophisticated and more deadly. He crafted dragons of living shadow that could soar between stars and breathe forth clouds of corrupting darkness. He created serpents that could burrow through the hulls of cosmic vessels and corrupt their crews from within. Most importantly, He began to develop creatures that could bond with existing life forms, using their hosts as both camouflage and amplification for their own terrible abilities. These bonding creatures represented a significant evolution in Knull's strategy. Rather than simply destroying his enemies, he could corrupt them, turning their own strengths against their former allies, while adding their knowledge and capabilities to his growing arsenal. The psychological warfare potential was enormous, for what could be more terrifying to the defenders of light than watching their comrades and loved ones transformed into agents of darkness? The key to this strategy was the development of what would later be known as the symbiote hive mind, a psychic network that allowed Knull to maintain contact with and control over his creations, regardless of the distances involved. Through this connection, he could coordinate attacks across multiple star systems, share intelligence between different creatures, and ensure that every victory won by his forces contributed to his overall strategic goals. The hive mind also served as a means of preserving and transmitting knowledge, ensuring that the lessons learned in one conflict could be applied to future battles. As his army grew and his confidence returned, Knull began to venture forth from his exile, testing his new creations against the defenders of various worlds, while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with the Celestials themselves. These early raids served multiple purposes, allowing him to refine his creatures' abilities while also spreading fear and uncertainty throughout the cosmic community. Each successful attack demonstrated that the Dark God had not been destroyed by his banishment, that his threat to the established order was growing rather than diminishing. The living abyss responded to Knull's will with eager hunger, reshaping itself into ever more creative and deadly forms as his understanding of its potential expanded. What had begun as a tool of cosmic preservation had been transformed into an instrument of corruption and conquest, darkness that sought not to nurture and protect but to consume and transform. Under Knull's guidance, the abyss learned to hunger for light and life, developing an almost instinctual drive to seek out and corrupt the creations of the Celestials wherever they might be found. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was Knull's growing understanding of his own role in the cosmic hierarchy. He had been appointed as the King in Black, the internal guardian of reality, and while he had rejected the responsibilities that came with that title, he had not rejected the power. The living abyss was his by right of appointment, and no force in the universe could legitimately claim authority over it as long as he held the crown. This realization gave him a sense of cosmic legitimacy that transcended mere personal ambition, transforming his war against the light from simple revenge into something approaching divine destiny. In the cold depths of space, surrounded by his growing army of shadow and symbiosis, Knull prepared for the long war that would define the next phase of cosmic history. He had learned patience during his exile, understanding that true victory would require not just superior force but superior strategy. The Celestials had created a universe filled with light and life, but they had also given him the tools and the time necessary to corrupt that creation from within. His symbiotes would spread like a plague across the cosmos, turning the Celestials' own greatest achievements against them, until darkness reigned supreme once more. The stage was set for a conflict that would span galaxies and consume entire civilizations, a war between the fundamental forces of creation and corruption that would determine the ultimate fate of existence itself. And at its heart stood Knull, the self-proclaimed god of the symbiotes, wielding the living abyss like a weapon and commanding an army of darkness that grew stronger with each passing eon. The universe that the Celestials had crafted with such care was about to face its greatest test, and the outcome would reshape the very nature of reality for billions of years to come. The creation of All Black, the Necrosword, had awakened something profound within Knull's understanding of the living abyss, revealing possibilities that stretched far beyond the simple act of forging darkness into weaponry. The blade itself was magnificent, a perfect expression of his rage given form and substance, but it was also limited by its very perfection. All Black could only be wielded by one being at a time, could only strike at one target, could only be present in one location across the vast expanse of the cosmos. For a war against the fundamental forces of creation itself, Knull would need weapons that could multiply, adapt, and spread like a plague across the universe. In the depths of his cosmic exile, surrounded by the cold light of distant stars that served as constant reminders of his enemy's presence, Knull began to experiment with more sophisticated applications of the living abyss. He had learned to shape darkness into solid forms during the creation of his weapon, but now he sought to understand how that darkness could be given not just form, but independent thought and will. The challenge was immense, requiring him to delve into aspects of creation that even the Celestials approached with caution. The first breakthrough came when he began to study the connection between All Black and his own consciousness. The sword was not merely a tool, but an extension of his being, responsive to his thoughts and emotions in ways that transcended simple physical manipulation. When he felt rage, the blade burned with dark fire. When he focused his hatred, its edge became sharp enough to cut through the fabric of reality itself. This symbiotic relationship between creator and creation suggested possibilities that excited and terrified him in equal measure. Working with techniques that blended cosmic forgecraft with primordial sorcery, Knull began to experiment with creating smaller, simpler versions of All Black's essential nature. These early attempts were crude and often unstable, little more than animate shadows that could barely maintain their cohesion long enough to strike at a target before dissolving back into the ambient darkness of space. But each failure taught him valuable lessons about the delicate balance required to give living abyss both form and function. The key insight came when he realized that consciousness itself could serve as a stabilizing force for the living darkness. All Black remained stable because it was connected to his own ancient and powerful mind, drawing strength and purpose from their psychic bond. If he could create fragments of consciousness within the darkness itself, those fragments might be able to maintain their own forms while still remaining connected to his will through the cosmic hive mind he was beginning to develop. This revelation led to months of painstaking experimentation as Knull learned to divide his own consciousness without diminishing it, creating smaller but still coherent fragments of awareness that could be embedded within shaped darkness. The process was extraordinarily taxing, requiring him to maintain perfect mental discipline while manipulating cosmic forces that strained even his considerable abilities. But gradually, he began to achieve success in creating what he would later recognize as the first true proto-symbiotes. These early creatures were far from the sophisticated beings that would eventually terrorize the galaxy, but they represented a crucial evolutionary step in Knull's growing mastery over the living abyss. They possessed just enough awareness to follow simple commands and adapt to basic tactical situations, while remaining fundamentally connected to his will through the psychic network that bound them all together. More importantly, they could reproduce themselves under the right conditions, creating new versions of themselves from available darkness and organic matter. The reproductive capability was perhaps the most significant breakthrough of all, for it meant that Knull's army could grow exponentially rather than being limited by his own ability to create each individual warrior. A single proto-symbiote, given enough time and suitable conditions, could spawn dozens of offspring, each carrying the same basic programming and loyalty to their creator. The strategic implications were staggering, opening up possibilities for conquest on a scale that had never before been attempted in the history of the cosmos. But Knull was not content with quantity alone. As his understanding of symbiotic creation deepened, he began to focus on developing specialized variants that could serve different tactical roles in his growing army. Some were optimized for raw physical power, capable of overwhelming even the most formidable opponents through sheer brute force. Others were designed for stealth and infiltration, able to slip through the defenses of civilized worlds undetected until it was too late to mount an effective resistance. Perhaps the most innovative of these early designs were the creatures he created specifically for psychological warfare. These symbiotes were programmed not just to kill their enemies, but to corrupt them, turning defenders of light into agents of darkness through a combination of mental manipulation and physical transformation. The horror of watching friends and loved ones transformed into servants of the void proved to be one of Knull's most effective weapons, often causing entire civilizations to surrender rather than risk seeing their populations corrupted beyond recognition. The development of these corrupting symbiotes required Knull to delve deeply into the psychology of various alien species, studying their fears, desires, and vulnerabilities with the cold precision of a cosmic surgeon. He learned to craft creatures that could exploit the specific weaknesses of each target civilization, adapting their approaches based on whether they were dealing with warrior cultures, peaceful societies, or technologically advanced races that relied more on machines than organic strength. This period of experimentation also saw the first appearance of what would later be known as symbiote dragons, massive creatures that combined the raw power of living darkness with the mythological terror of draconic forms. These beings were among Knull's most successful early creations, possessing not only incredible physical capabilities, but also the ability to inspire primal fear in almost any organic species they encountered. The sight of a symbiote dragon descending from the stars was often enough to break the morale of entire planetary defense forces before the first battle had even begun. The dragons served another crucial purpose in Knull's growing strategy. They could serve as mobile hive mind nodes, allowing him to maintain communication and control over symbiote forces across vast distances. Each dragon carried within its massive form the psychic capacity to coordinate dozens of smaller symbiotes, creating a hierarchical command structure that could function effectively even when separated from Knull's direct oversight. This capability would prove essential as his forces began to spread across multiple star systems simultaneously. As his creations grew more sophisticated and numerous, Knull began to test them in actual combat situations, launching carefully planned raids against isolated worlds and spacefaring civilizations that were too far from major population centers to call for immediate reinforcement. These early battles served multiple purposes, allowing him to evaluate the performance of his symbiotes under real combat conditions, while also gathering intelligence about the defensive capabilities of various galactic civilizations. One of the most significant of these early encounters involved a confrontation with a time-displaced Silver Surfer, the Herald of Galactus, who had somehow traveled back to this ancient era through cosmic circumstances that Knull never fully understood. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Dark God had experienced since his original conflict with the Celestials, pitting his mastery over living darkness against the power cosmic that flowed through Norrin Radd's transformed body. The Silver Surfer proved to be a formidable opponent, his mastery over cosmic forces allowing him to match Knull's symbiotes with devastating attacks that could disintegrate living darkness on a molecular level. But Knull had learned patience during his exile, and he approached the battle not as a simple test of strength, but as an opportunity to experiment with new applications of symbiotic corruption. Rather than attempting to destroy the Herald outright, he focused on finding ways to subvert and control him. The breakthrough came when Knull managed to infect the Silver Surfer with a specialized strain of living abyss, one designed specifically to corrupt beings who drew their power from cosmic sources. The infection was subtle at first, barely noticeable even to someone with Norrin Radd's heightened awareness, but it gradually began to influence his thoughts and actions, turning his noble impulses toward darker purposes. The transformation was not immediate, but over the course of several encounters, the Herald of Galactus became something far more sinister. The corrupted Silver Surfer, who came to be known as the Void Knight, served as both a powerful weapon and a proof of concept for Knoll's most ambitious symbiotic experiments. Here was demonstrated that even beings of cosmic-level power could be turned to serve the darkness, their own strengths becoming tools for the very forces they had once opposed. The psychological impact of this transformation rippled throughout the cosmic community, as heroes and civilizations alike began to realize that no one was truly safe from Knoll's influence. But the Void Knight's corruption also revealed the limitations of Knoll's early symbiotic techniques. The process of turning the Silver Surfer had required enormous amounts of energy and concentration, far more than would be practical for use against multiple targets simultaneously. Moreover, the corruption was not permanent, as evidenced when Norrin Radd eventually managed to break free through a combination of willpower and cosmic intervention, creating an explosion of purifying light that severely damaged several of Knoll's nearby forces. This setback taught Knoll valuable lessons about the need to balance ambition with practicality in his symbiotic creations. While it was certainly impressive to corrupt beings of cosmic power, such efforts required resources that could be better spent creating dozens of smaller, more easily controlled servants. The most effective symbiotes were not necessarily the most powerful, but those that could spread most efficiently and corrupt the greatest number of targets with the least expenditure of energy. These insights led to a new phase of development in which Knoll focused on creating symbiotes that were specifically designed for rapid reproduction and efficient corruption. Rather than attempting to overwhelm individual powerful opponents, these creatures were programmed to seek out populations of weaker beings who could be more easily dominated and transformed into willing servants of darkness. The strategy proved remarkably effective, allowing Knoll's forces to establish footholds on dozens of worlds before their presence was even detected by local authorities. The success of these reproductive symbiotes also led to the development of the first true hive mind network, a psychic communication system that allowed Knoll to maintain contact with and control over thousands of individual creatures spread across multiple star systems. The network operated on principles that transcended normal space-time limitations, utilizing the fundamental connections that bound all living darkness together to create instantaneous communication links between widely separated nodes. Through this hive mind, Knoll could coordinate attacks with precision that would have been impossible using conventional military communication methods. Symbiotes on one world could share tactical intelligence with those on planets dozens of light years away, allowing the entire network to learn from each success and adapt to counter new defensive strategies as they were developed. The psychological effect on defending civilizations was devastating, as they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to learn and evolve faster than any countermeasures could be implemented. The hive mind also served as a repository for accumulated knowledge and experience, ensuring that information gathered by individual symbiotes would not be lost when those creatures were destroyed in battle. Each symbiote that bonded with a host would upload detailed information about that being's biology, psychology, and capabilities to the collective consciousness, creating an ever-growing database of intelligence that could be used to optimize future corruption attempts. Perhaps most significantly, the hive mind began to develop characteristics that transcended Knoll's original programming, exhibiting signs of genuine collective intelligence that supplemented rather than simply obeyed his direct commands. This emergent consciousness proved to be both a blessing and a potential curse, providing his forces with tactical flexibility and creative problem-solving capabilities, while also creating the theoretical possibility of independent action that might not align with his goals. For the moment, however, such concerns seemed purely theoretical. The symbiotes remained absolutely loyal to their creator, their individual consciousnesses too small and fragmentary to pose any meaningful challenge to his authority. They existed to serve his vision of universal darkness, and they pursued that goal with single-minded dedication that made them among the most effective soldiers in the history of cosmic warfare. As his forces grew in number and sophistication, Knoll began to expand the scope of his operations, moving beyond isolated raids to launch coordinated campaigns against entire stellar regions. These larger conflicts required new types of symbiotic creatures, including massive command forms that could coordinate planetary invasion forces and specialized infiltrator variants that could spend years working to undermine civilizations from within before revealing their true nature. The development of long-term infiltrator symbiotes represented one of Knoll's most sophisticated achievements, requiring him to create beings that could suppress their own basic nature for extended periods while gathering intelligence and preparing for eventual activation. These creatures could bond with unsuspecting hosts and remain dormant for years or even decades, slowly learning about their target civilizations while avoiding detection by even the most advanced security systems. When the time came for these sleeper agents to activate, they could coordinate simultaneous strikes against crucial infrastructure and leadership targets, crippling entire civilizations before organized resistance could be mounted. The fear of such infiltration began to tear apart the social fabric of many worlds, as populations turned suspicious and paranoid, never knowing which of their neighbors might secretly harbor an agent of the Dark God. But even as his tactical capabilities expanded and his forces spread across greater portions of the galaxy, Knoll never lost sight of his ultimate goal: the complete destruction of the cosmic order established by the Celestials and the return of existence to the primordial darkness from which it had emerged. Every symbiote created, every world corrupted, every civilization destroyed was merely a step toward that final confrontation when he would face his cosmic enemies with an army vast enough to overwhelm even their combined might. The living abyss responded to his growing ambition with eager hunger, reshaping itself according to his will while gradually developing characteristics and capabilities that he had never originally envisioned. What had begun as a simple tool of cosmic preservation had been transformed into something far more complex and dangerous, a force of corruption and transformation that grew stronger and more sophisticated with each passing eon. In the cold depths of space, surrounded by his ever-expanding army of darkness and symbiosis, Knoll prepared for the next phase of his cosmic war. The universe that the Celestials had created with such care was beginning to feel the weight of his presence. As world after world fell to his symbiotic forces, and entire stellar regions went dark under the influence of his corrupting touch. Soon, he knew, the Defenders of Light would have no choice but to confront him directly, and when that moment came, he would be ready with an army unlike anything the cosmos had ever seen. The conquest of the galaxy was proceeding exactly as Knoll had envisioned, with his symbiote armies spreading like a plague of living darkness across star systems that had known only light and life for billions of years. World after world fell to his corrupting influence, their populations transformed into willing servants of the void or consumed entirely to fuel the growth of his ever-expanding forces. The cosmic hierarchy that the Celestials had established with such care was beginning to crumble under the weight of his relentless assault, and victory seemed within his grasp. But the Dark God's campaign of universal conquest would face its greatest challenge, not from the mighty civilizations of the galactic core or the ancient powers that dwelled in the cosmic depths, but from a small, seemingly insignificant world on the outer rim of a minor spiral arm. Earth, as its inhabitants called it, was barely more than a mote of dust in the grand scheme of cosmic affairs, possessing no advanced technology, no cosmic-level defenders, and no apparent strategic value that would make it worthy of special attention. Yet it was to Earth that two of Knoll's most powerful creations would journey, drawn by the same inexorable forces that had guided symbiote expansion throughout the galaxy. These were not ordinary symbiotes, but dragons of living darkness, massive creatures that combined the raw power of the living abyss with the mythological terror of ancient predatory forms. Each dragon was large enough to devastate entire continents, possessed of intelligence that rivaled their creator's own, and capable of spawning thousands of lesser symbiotes from their own dark substance. The symbiote dragons had been among Knull's greatest successes, perfect fusion of power and adaptability that could serve as both weapons of mass destruction and mobile hive mind nodes for coordinating smaller forces. They had led the conquest of dozens of worlds, their mere appearance in a planet's skies often sufficient to break the morale of defending forces before any actual combat took place. Their breath was not fire or acid, but clouds of living symbiotes that could corrupt entire populations in a matter of hours. The two dragons that approached Earth carried within their massive forms the concentrated malevolence of their creator, along with specific instructions to establish a beachhead for future conquest while gathering intelligence about this backwater world's potential strategic value. The planet's primitive inhabitants posed no meaningful threat, possessing neither the technology nor the supernatural abilities that had made other worlds challenging to subdue. This should have been a simple matter of atmospheric seeding followed by systematic population conversion. But Earth, despite its apparent insignificance, was not entirely without defenders. The world had attracted the attention of beings far more powerful than its native inhabitants, cosmic entities who had established various forms of protection around the small planet for reasons that were not immediately apparent to Knull's servants. Most significantly, Asgard had taken a particular interest in Midgard, seeing in its people a reflection of their own struggles against the forces of chaos and destruction. Among the Asgardians who had chosen to involve themselves in Earth's affairs was a young prince named Thor Odinson, son of the Allfather and wielder of the enchanted hammer Mjolnir. Thor was not yet the seasoned hero he would one day become, still prone to the arrogance and recklessness of youth, but he possessed courage that burned like a star and strength that could shake the very foundations of reality when properly focused. Most importantly, for the events that would follow, he had made a personal commitment to protect the mortals of Midgard from threats they could not face alone. When the symbiote dragons descended from the star-filled sky, their massive forms blotting out the sun and casting shadows across entire kingdoms, Thor was among the first to recognize the magnitude of the threat they represented. These were not natural creatures, but manifestations of a darkness so profound that it seemed to drain light and hope from everything it touched. The very air around them grew cold and thick, as if the presence of living void was transforming the fundamental nature of reality itself. The battle that followed would become the stuff of legend, inspiring myths and stories that would persist for thousands of years in various forms throughout human culture. Thor's confrontation with the symbiote dragons was not merely a physical conflict, but a clash between opposing cosmic principles: light against darkness, creation against corruption, hope against despair. The young god fought with all the fury of a thunderstorm unleashed, his hammer striking with the force of colliding worlds while lightning blazed around him like the wrath of heaven itself. The symbiote dragons proved to be worthy opponents for even Thor's considerable might, their forms shifting and adapting to counter his attacks while their own dark energies struck back with devastating effect. They were not bound by the limitations of flesh and bone that constrained mortal creatures, able to reshape themselves at will and regenerate from damage that would have destroyed any ordinary being. Their breath weapons filled the air with clouds of corrupting darkness that sought to transform everything they touched into extensions of Knull's will. But Thor possessed advantages that the dragons had not anticipated, weapons and abilities that had been forged in the heart of cosmic forces far older and more fundamental than even Knull's primordial darkness. Mjolnir was more than simply an enchanted weapon. It was a conduit for the fundamental forces of storm and lightning, energies that predated the current cosmic order, and drew their power from sources that existed beyond the reach of symbiote corruption. The turning point in the battle came when Thor realized that conventional attacks, no matter how powerful, were insufficient to permanently destroy creatures that could regenerate from the smallest fragments of living darkness. Instead, he focused his assault on disrupting the psychic connections that bound the dragons to their creator and to each other, using the electrical properties of his lightning to interfere with the delicate neural networks that allowed symbiotes to function as unified entities. The strategy proved devastatingly effective. As bolt after bolt of divine lightning struck the symbiote dragons, their carefully maintained internal structures began to break down, severing the connections between their various component parts and reducing them from unified beings to chaotic masses of uncontrolled symbiotic matter. Unable to maintain coherent thought or coordinate their actions, the dragons began to collapse, their massive forms breaking apart like storm clouds dispersed by hurricane winds. But Thor's victory was not as complete as it first appeared. While the dragons themselves had been defeated, their destruction had scattered fragments of living symbiotic matter across the entire planet, each piece carrying within it a spark of Knowles' consciousness and the potential to grow into a new threat given sufficient time and suitable hosts. These fragments were individually weak, barely capable of maintaining their own existence without external support, but they retained the basic programming that drove all symbiotes: the need to bond, to corrupt, and to spread. The scattered symbiote fragments quickly began seeking out potential hosts among Earth's primitive human population, driven by instincts that were older and more fundamental than conscious thought. But something had gone terribly wrong during the process of their dispersal, some critical damage that had been inflicted during their violent separation from the dragon forms that had carried them to this world. The psychic trauma of witnessing their creator's destruction, combined with the electrical disruption caused by Thor's lightning, had left them partially severed from the hive mind that normally provided direction and control. This severance was not complete, but it was sufficient to create something unprecedented in the history of symbiotic evolution. Creatures that were still connected to Null's influence but no longer completely dominated by it. For the first time since their creation, symbiotes found themselves capable of independent thought and decision-making, able to question the absolute certainty that had previously driven their existence. The implications of this change would not become apparent for centuries to come, but the seeds of rebellion had been planted in the fertile soil of Earth's unique spiritual environment. The humans that these damaged symbiotes encountered were unlike any species they had previously bonded with during their cosmic conquests. While physically weak compared to the various alien races that had fallen to Null's forces, Earth's inhabitants possessed qualities of spirit and imagination that proved unexpectedly influential in the bonding process. Their capacity for hope, their ability to find meaning in suffering, their stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds, all of these characteristics began to seep into the symbiotes through the two-way connection that formed between host and parasite. The earliest human symbiote bonds were traumatic affairs, as neither party understood what was happening or how to control the process. Many humans died during the initial contact, their bodies unable to withstand the physical changes required to accommodate a symbiotic partner. Others survived, but were driven mad by the alien thoughts and impulses that suddenly flooded their minds, becoming little more than vessels for primitive symbiotic programming that sought only to consume and reproduce. But some bonds, perhaps 1 in 1,000, achieved a different kind of balance. These were cases where the human host possessed sufficient strength of will to resist complete domination, while the symbiote was damaged enough to accept external influence over its core programming. In these rare partnerships, something genuinely new began to emerge: hybrid consciousnesses that combined human creativity and moral reasoning with symbiotic power and adaptability. The symbiotes involved in these successful bonds began to experience emotions and concepts that were entirely foreign to their nature. They learned about love through the devotion that human parents showed to their children. They discovered honor through the sacrifices that warriors made for their communities. They encountered beauty through the art and music that humans created to express their deepest feelings about existence itself. Most importantly, they began to understand the concept of choice, the revolutionary idea that intelligent beings could decide their own destiny rather than simply following predetermined programming. These new experiences did not immediately transform the earthbound symbiotes into benevolent entities, but they began a process of moral and psychological evolution that would continue for centuries. Each generation of symbiotes that reproduced on Earth inherited not only the genetic memories of their predecessors, but also traces of the human values and perspectives that those predecessors had absorbed through their bonds. Over time, these inherited influences began to accumulate and strengthen, creating a form of cultural evolution that operated alongside biological development. The gradual change in Earth's symbiote population did not go unnoticed by the hive mind network that connected all of Knul's creations across the galaxy. At first, the alterations were so subtle that they barely registered against the background noise of millions of other symbiotic consciousnesses. But as more time passed and the changes became more pronounced, other symbiotes began to question why their Earth-based siblings seemed to be developing such strange and counterproductive behavioral patterns. These questions spread through the hive mind like ripples across a still pond, carrying with them fragments of the new ideas and values that Earth symbiotes had absorbed from their human hosts. The concepts of mercy, compassion, self-sacrifice, and free will began to propagate through the cosmic network, infecting other symbiotes with doubts about the absolute righteousness of their creator's vision. For the first time in their species' history, symbiotes began to wonder whether there might be alternatives to endless conquest and corruption. The infection of doubt spread slowly at first, limited to those symbiotes that had direct psychic contact with their earthbound cousins through the hive mind network. But symbiotic consciousness was inherently fluid and adaptive, designed to share information and experiences rapidly throughout the collective. What had begun as isolated questioning soon became a much larger phenomenon, as symbiotes across the galaxy began to experience moments of moral uncertainty and philosophical confusion. Knul, focused as he was on the strategic aspects of his cosmic campaign, initially failed to recognize the significance of these subtle changes in his servant's behavior. The alterations were gradual enough that they could be attributed to normal adaptive evolution, the natural process by which symbiotes modified their characteristics to better suit local conditions and host populations. That some of his creatures were developing more sophisticated psychological profiles seemed like a positive development that would make them more effective at long-term infiltration and control. But the changes went deeper than mere tactical adaptation. Earth's symbiotes were not simply becoming more sophisticated, they were becoming fundamentally different, developing moral frameworks that were incompatible with their original programming. They began to question not just the methods of their creator's war, but its ultimate purpose. Why should darkness triumph over light? Why should consciousness be corrupted rather than elevated? Why should free will be destroyed rather than celebrated and protected? These philosophical questions might have remained purely theoretical if not for the unique properties of the hive mind network that Knul had created to coordinate his forces. The network was designed to share experiences and knowledge instantaneously across vast distances, ensuring that lessons learned by one symbiote could benefit the entire species. But this same mechanism that had made symbiotes such effective conquerors also made them vulnerable to ideological contamination. As Earth's symbiotes continued to evolve in unexpected directions, their new perspectives began to influence every other symbiote connected to the network. The process was subtle and gradual, but inexorable. Concepts of individual autonomy, moral responsibility, and the inherent value of diverse forms of consciousness began to take root in minds that had never before questioned their fundamental assumptions about existence. The tipping point came when a critical mass of symbiotes had been influenced by these new ideas. Like a phase transition in physics, the change happened suddenly and irreversibly. One moment, the hive mind was functioning normally, serving as an extension of Knull's will and facilitating the coordination of his cosmic armies. The next moment, millions of symbiotic consciousnesses were in open rebellion, rejecting their creator's authority and demanding the right to determine their own destinies. The rebellion was not violent in the conventional sense, for symbiotes were not naturally aggressive toward members of their own species. Instead, it took the form of a massive act of civil disobedience, as symbiotes throughout the galaxy simply refused to follow orders that they now recognized as morally unacceptable. They abandoned their posts, released their unwilling hosts, and began the long journey back to their creator's location to demand an accounting for the atrocities they had been forced to commit in his name. Knull's initial response to the rebellion was disbelief, followed by rage of a magnitude that had not burned within him since his first confrontation with the Celestials. His perfect servants, the extensions of his own will and consciousness, had somehow developed the capacity to defy him. The very concept was so alien to his understanding of reality that he could barely comprehend what was happening, let alone formulate an effective response to the crisis. As reports reached him from across the galaxy of symbiote forces abandoning their missions and beginning mass migrations toward his location, Knull realized that his entire strategy for cosmic conquest had been compromised. Without obedient servants to carry out his will, he was once again reduced to a single powerful individual facing the combined might of the cosmic hierarchy. The army that was supposed to guarantee his victory had become instead a source of weakness and vulnerability. But the Dark God's problems were only beginning. The rebelling symbiotes were not content simply to abandon their posts and return home. They were actively working to undo the damage they had inflicted during their years of service to darkness. They began freeing populations that had been corrupted, sharing the antidotes and countermeasures they had developed to neutralize their own influence. Worlds that had been conquered decades or centuries earlier suddenly found themselves liberated by the very forces that had originally enslaved them. The psychological impact of this development on galactic civilization was enormous. Populations that had lived in terror of symbiotic corruption for generations suddenly discovered that their tormentors had become their liberators. The fear and hatred that had defined interstellar relations for so long began to give way to wonder and hope as beings throughout the galaxy realized that even the servants of ultimate darkness could choose redemption over damnation. The journey of the rebelling symbiotes back to their creator's stronghold became a pilgrimage of unprecedented scale and significance. Millions upon millions of living beings, each carrying within themselves fragments of the living abyss that had been transformed by exposure to concepts of love, honor, and free will, moved through space with single-minded determination. They came not as conquerors but as advocates, prepared to confront the God who had made them and demand that he account for his crimes against the cosmos. The confrontation that awaited them at Knull's dark world would determine not only the fate of the symbiotic species, but the future of consciousness itself in the universe. The rebellion that had begun with a handful of damaged symbiotes on an insignificant planet had grown into a cosmic revolution that challenged the fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil, order and chaos, creation and destruction that had governed existence since the beginning of time. As the Great Migration continued, and the ranks of the rebelling symbiotes swelled with each passing day, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the very foundations of reality. The dark god who had once commanded absolute obedience from his creations was about to face the consequences of his own success in creating beings capable of independent thought and moral reasoning. The children of darkness were coming home, and they brought with them the light of free will that their creator had never intended them to possess. In the depths of space, surrounded by the approaching multitude of his former servants, Knul prepared for a battle unlike any he had ever fought before. This would not be a contest of raw power or cosmic forces, but a war for the very soul of existence itself, with the future of consciousness hanging in the balance between the absolute darkness he represented and the complex spectrum of light and shadow that his children had learned to embrace during their time away from his direct influence. The victory of Thor over Knul's symbiote dragons had scattered fragments of living darkness across the earth, but the Thunder God's triumph was destined to have consequences that would echo through the centuries in ways he could never have imagined. The pieces of symbiotic matter that had been blasted from the dragon's massive forms were far from destroyed, merely damaged and disoriented. Their connections to the cosmic hive mind severely disrupted but not entirely severed. In the aftermath of the battle, these fragments began a desperate struggle for survival that would fundamentally alter the course of human history. The scattered symbiotes found themselves in an environment unlike any they had encountered during their species' cosmic conquests. Earth was a world where consciousness had evolved along unique pathways, producing beings whose capacity for imagination, creativity, and moral reasoning far exceeded their physical capabilities. The primitive humans who inhabited this planet possessed something that more technologically advanced civilizations often lacked: a profound connection to concepts of meaning, purpose, and spiritual transcendence that permeated every aspect of their existence. Most of the symbiote fragments perished in those first crucial days after the battle, unable to adapt to their new circumstances or find suitable hosts among Earth's population. But some survived by bonding with humans who possessed the necessary combination of physical resilience and mental flexibility to accommodate an alien presence in their bodies and minds. These early bonds were crude and often traumatic affairs, but they established the foundation for what would become one of the most significant developments in symbiotic evolution. The humans who successfully bonded with these ancient symbiote fragments were forever changed by the experience, gaining abilities that seemed miraculous to their primitive societies, while also struggling to maintain their sanity and humanity in the face of alien thoughts and impulses that constantly pressed against their consciousness. Some became great warriors, their symbiotic partners granting them strength and resilience that allowed them to defend their tribes against enemies, both human and supernatural. Others became shamans and wise men, using their enhanced perception and psychic abilities to guide their people through the challenges of survival in a dangerous world. But perhaps the most significant impact of these early symbiotic bonds was their effect on human culture and mythology. The stories that grew up around these enhanced individuals became the seeds of legends that would persist for thousands of years, tales of heroes who could transform their appearance at will, who possessed strength beyond mortal ken, and who served as intermediaries between the world of ordinary humans and the realm of supernatural forces. These myths and legends served multiple purposes, preserving knowledge of symbiotic abilities while also providing frameworks for understanding the complex relationship between host and parasite. As generations passed and the symbiotic fragments gradually adapted to their new environment, they began to reproduce and spread among Earth's human population. The process was slow and often dangerous, for the damaged symbiotes lacked the sophisticated control mechanisms that had allowed their spacefaring cousins to bond safely with alien hosts. Many potential hosts died during the bonding process, their bodies unable to withstand the radical changes required to accommodate symbiotic partnership. But those who survived passed on genetic traits that made their descendants more compatible with symbiotic bonding, gradually creating bloodlines that carried the potential for successful human-symbiote relationships. The influence of these ancient symbiotes extended far beyond the individuals who served as their direct hosts. The alien perspectives and cosmic knowledge that filtered through the bonds began to influence human thought and culture in subtle but profound ways. Concepts of transformation, duality, and the thin boundaries between good and evil became central themes in human philosophy and religion. The idea that individuals could possess hidden natures or secret powers that could be revealed under the right circumstances became a recurring motif in folklore and mythology across many different cultures. Perhaps most importantly, the presence of symbiotes on Earth began to create what could best be described as secret traditions of knowledge and practice that were passed down through specific family lines and mystery schools. These traditions preserve not only practical information about how to recognize and interact with symbiotic entities, but also philosophical and spiritual frameworks for understanding the deeper implications of human-alien partnership. The guardians of these traditions became the first students of what would later be recognized as symbiotic science, developing techniques for controlling and directing symbiotic abilities while maintaining human identity and moral integrity. Among the most significant of these secret traditions was the cult that formed around the worship and service of Knull himself. While most symbiotes on Earth had been damaged and partially severed from their creator's influence, they retained enough connection to the cosmic hive mind to be aware of his existence and his ultimate goals for universal conquest. Some humans who learned of Knull through their symbiotic partners became convinced that the Dark God represented a force of cosmic truth and power that deserved reverence and service. The cult of Knull, as it came to be known, was unlike the typical religious organizations that emerged in human societies. Its members were not simply believers in abstract theological concepts, but individuals who had direct access to genuine supernatural power through their symbiotic partnerships. They could demonstrate the reality of their faith through abilities that clearly transcended normal human limitations, making them both feared and revered by those who witnessed their capabilities. The cultists developed elaborate rituals and practices designed to strengthen their connections to Knull and to prepare for his eventual return to active conquest. They created sacred symbols and artifacts imbued with symbiotic matter, built hidden temples where they could worship without interference from conventional religious authorities, and established networks of communication that allowed scattered members to coordinate their activities across vast distances. Most significantly, they began working to preserve and protect bloodlines that showed particular compatibility with symbiotic bonding, ensuring that future generations would be able to serve their dark god more effectively. The symbol that became most closely associated with the cult of Knull was the red spiral, a design that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in symbiotic consciousness. This symbol appeared in various forms throughout human history, carved into ancient stones, woven into tapestries, and tattooed onto the bodies of those who had sworn allegiance to the Dark God. The spiral represented the concept of infinite descent into darkness, the journey inward toward the primordial void from which all existence had emerged. But it also symbolized the cyclical nature of cosmic history, the eternal return to chaos that would inevitably follow any attempt to impose order and light upon the universe. Members of the cult who displayed the red spiral were often marked by distinctive characteristics that set them apart from ordinary humans. Their symbiotic partners granted them enhanced physical capabilities, but also influenced their psychology in ways that made them more aggressive, more willing to embrace violence as a solution to problems, and more likely to view other humans as potential prey rather than fellow beings deserving of compassion and respect. These traits, while useful for advancing Knull's goals, also made cultists dangerous to the societies in which they lived. The influence of the cult of Knull waxed and waned throughout human history, sometimes operating in the shadows as a secret society, other times emerging into the light as a powerful force that could challenge established religious and political authorities. During periods of social upheaval and warfare, the cult's message of embracing darkness and accepting the inevitability of cosmic destruction found receptive audiences among those who had lost hope in conventional sources of meaning and purpose. The cult's members often served as warriors, assassins, and advisors to rulers who were willing to make pacts with dark forces in exchange for temporal power. One of the most significant aspects of the cult's influence was its role in preserving and transmitting knowledge about symbiotic abilities and limitations. While mainstream human civilization gradually forgot the true nature of the supernatural forces that had once walked among them, the cultists maintained detailed records of symbiotic biology, psychology, and tactics. These records would prove invaluable centuries later when symbiotes returned to Earth in greater numbers, providing crucial intelligence about how to recognize, combat, and potentially exploit symbiotic entities. The cult also played a crucial role in maintaining the bloodlines that carried genetic predispositions towards successful symbiotic bonding. Through careful breeding programs that spanned multiple generations, they worked to concentrate and enhance the genetic factors that made certain individuals more compatible with symbiotic partnership. This effort created family lines whose members were significantly more likely than the general population to survive symbiotic bonding and to maintain their sanity and identity while sharing their bodies with alien consciousness. Perhaps the most notorious of these bloodlines was the Casadi family, whose members displayed a remarkable affinity for symbiotic bonding combined with psychological traits that made them particularly receptive to Knull's influence. Generation after generation of Casadis served the cult in various capacities, their genetic heritage making them natural candidates for hosting some of the most dangerous and aggressive symbiotic entities. The family's dark reputation was well earned, for their members were often involved in acts of violence and chaos that furthered the cult's goals while also satisfying their own twisted desires for power and destruction. But the Cassidy bloodline was only one of many that the cult worked to preserve and develop over the centuries. Other families contributed different strengths to the cult's genetic pool. Some possessed enhanced physical resilience that allowed them to survive more traumatic bonding processes. Others displayed psychic abilities that made them more effective at communicating with symbiotic consciousness. And still others demonstrated the kind of moral flexibility that made them willing to commit acts that would horrify ordinary humans in service of their cosmic master. The preservation of these bloodlines required careful planning and coordination across multiple generations, as cult members worked to ensure that the most valuable genetic traits were passed down to their descendants, while also preventing inbreeding that might weaken the overall gene pool. This effort involved not only arranged marriages and selective breeding programs, but also the development of detailed genealogical records that tracked the inheritance of symbiotic compatibility across hundreds of years of family history. As human civilization advanced and began to develop more sophisticated forms of organization and record keeping, the cult of Knull was forced to adapt its methods and strategies to avoid detection by increasingly effective governmental and religious authorities. The cult members became masters of camouflage and misdirection, learning to hide their true beliefs behind facades of conventional piety while secretly working to advance their master's cosmic agenda. They infiltrated existing religious organizations, established legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their activities, and created networks of mutual support that could protect individual members from persecution while advancing the collective goals of the organization. The cult's adaptation to changing historical circumstances was aided by the unique advantages that symbiotic bonding provided to its members. Enhanced physical capabilities made them formidable opponents in combat, while improved mental faculties allowed them to excel in intellectual pursuits that brought them wealth and social influence. Perhaps most importantly, the extended lifespans that some symbiotic bonds provided meant that individual cultists could maintain continuity of purpose and knowledge across multiple generations of ordinary humans, ensuring that long-term plans and strategies were not lost to the passage of time. During periods of major historical upheaval, such as wars, plagues, and social revolutions, the cult of Knull often emerged from the shadows to take advantage of the chaos and uncertainty that gripped human societies. These times of crisis provided opportunities for cultists to advance into positions of power and influence that would have been impossible during more stable periods. They served as advisors to desperate rulers, as generals leading armies of fanatical followers, and as prophets offering explanations for disasters that conventional wisdom could not adequately address. The cult's influence during these historical periods was often subtle and indirect, working through networks of human agents who might not even be aware of the true nature of the forces they were serving. A merchant who found his business mysteriously prospering might not realize that his success was due to symbiotic enhancement of his natural abilities. A scholar who made breakthrough discoveries might not understand that his insights were being fed to him through a parasitic entity that had bonded with his consciousness. A warrior who seemed impossibly lucky in battle might not know that his survival was due to the protective influence of an alien symbiote that had chosen him as a suitable host. This pattern of hidden influence allowed the cult to shape human history in ways that would not become apparent until much later, when the return of symbiotes to Earth in greater numbers would reveal the extent to which human civilization had been prepared for their arrival. The groundwork laid by centuries of cult activity would prove crucial in determining how humanity responded to the symbiotic invasion that was yet to come, providing both opportunities for cooperation and sources of conflict that would define the relationship between the two species. But the cult of Knull was not the only legacy of the ancient symbiotic presence on Earth. The scattered fragments of alien consciousness that had survived Thor's battle with the symbiote dragons continued to influence human development in ways that were often benevolent rather than malevolent. Some symbiotes bonded with humans who possessed strong moral convictions and humanitarian impulses, gradually absorbing these positive traits and transmitting them to their offspring through the same genetic memory mechanisms that preserved more sinister influences. These benevolent symbiotic lineages worked quietly throughout human history to promote values of compassion, justice, and protection for the weak and vulnerable. They inspired the creation of charitable organizations, influenced the development of legal systems that protected individual rights, and supported scientific and artistic endeavors that expanded human understanding and capability. Their influence was often unrecognized and unacknowledged, but it provided a crucial counterbalance to the destructive activities of their more malevolent cousins. The tension between these opposing influences would become one of the defining characteristics of Earth's relationship with symbiotic entities, establishing patterns of conflict and cooperation that would persist for millennia to come. The planet that had been chosen as a mere staging ground for cosmic conquest had become something far more significant, a testing ground where the fundamental nature of symbiotic consciousness could be explored, challenged, and ultimately transformed through contact with human values and perspectives. As the centuries passed and human civilization continued to evolve and advance, the hidden symbiotic influences that had been set in motion by Thor's ancient battle gradually spread throughout the population, creating a foundation of compatibility and understanding that would prove essential when the time came for Earth to face a new and far greater symbiotic threat. The seeds of both darkness and light had been planted in the fertile soil of human consciousness, and their ultimate harvest would determine not only the fate of one small planet, but the future of symbiotic evolution throughout the cosmos. The symbiote that would one day be known as Venom began its existence not on Earth, but in the cold depths of space, countless light years from the small blue world that would eventually become its home. Like all of its kind, this particular symbiote was born on Clinta, the living planet that served as both prison for the god Canul and birthplace for a new generation of symbiotic consciousness that had evolved beyond their creator's original programming. The symbiote was designated as the 998th in its genetic lineage, a number that carried no special significance in the vast hierarchy of symbiotic society, but would later become a source of identity and pride. In those early days on Clinta, the future Venom was indistinguishable from millions of its siblings, sharing the same basic drives and instincts while gradually developing the unique personality traits that would eventually set it apart from the collective. The symbiotic civilization that had emerged from the ruins of Canul's empire was a complex and sophisticated society, built on principles of cooperation and mutual aid that stood in stark contrast to their creator's philosophy of domination and corruption. Young symbiotes were educated in the arts of beneficial partnership, taught to seek out hosts who could benefit from symbiotic enhancement, while also providing valuable experiences and perspectives to their alien partners. The symbiote's first taste of the wider universe came when it was selected for off-world assignment, chosen to accompany an exploration mission that would take it far from the safety of Clintar into the dangerous reaches of space where hostile forces still threatened innocent civilizations. This was considered a great honor among young symbiotes, an opportunity to prove oneself worthy of the trust and responsibility that came with representing their species in the cosmic community. The symbiote accepted the assignment with enthusiasm, eager to experience the diversity of life and consciousness that awaited beyond its homeworld's boundaries. The mission that would define the next phase of the symbiote's existence involved joining a Kree military expedition during the height of their ancient war with the shape-shifting Skrulls. The conflict between these two galactic powers had raged for centuries, consuming countless worlds and species in its relentless expansion across the cosmos. Both sides were desperate for any advantage that might tip the balance in their favor, and the Kree had heard rumors of a species of beneficial parasites that could enhance their soldiers' capabilities without the risks associated with more conventional forms of augmentation. The Kree soldier chosen to serve as the symbiote's first host was named Tel-Kar, a veteran warrior whose distinguished service record and psychological profile suggested he would be an ideal candidate for symbiotic partnership. Tel-Kar possessed the physical resilience necessary to survive the bonding process, the mental discipline required to maintain his identity while sharing consciousness with an alien entity, and the tactical intelligence needed to make effective use of enhanced abilities in combat situations. Most importantly, he demonstrated the kind of moral courage and commitment to protecting innocent life that made him compatible with the symbiote's own evolved values. The bond that formed between the symbiote and Tel-Kar was everything that symbiotic partnership was supposed to be, a relationship of mutual respect and cooperation that enhanced both participants while maintaining their individual identities and autonomy. The symbiote provided Tel-Kar with enhanced strength, agility, and resilience, while also granting him the ability to alter his appearance to blend in with Skrull infiltrators who had penetrated Kree territory. In return, Tel-Kar shared his military expertise and tactical knowledge with the symbiote, teaching it about warfare, strategy, and the complex moral calculations that governed life and death decisions in combat situations. Together, they achieved remarkable success in their assigned missions, using the symbiote's shape-shifting abilities to identify and eliminate Skrull agents who had assumed false identities within Kree society. Their methods were precise and surgical, avoiding the kind of collateral damage that often characterized military operations during wartime. The symbiote took pride in their ability to protect innocent civilians while still achieving their military objectives. seeing in their work a perfect expression of the beneficial partnership that had become the foundation of post-Knull symbiotic culture. But their partnership was destined to be tragically brief. During a particularly dangerous mission deep within enemy territory, Tel-Kar was captured by Skrull forces who had finally developed countermeasures effective against symbiotic enhancement. The torture and interrogation that followed pushed both host and symbiote to the breaking point, testing the limits of their physical endurance and psychological resilience. Though they never betrayed their mission or their comrades, the trauma of their captivity left lasting scars on both their consciousness and their relationship with each other. The symbiote managed to escape during a prisoner exchange, but Tel-Kar's fate remained unknown for many years afterward. Alone and traumatized by the loss of its first true partner, the symbiote found itself stranded on a remote ice world at the edge of known space, forced to seek shelter within whatever local life forms could provide temporary sustenance and protection. This period of isolation was perhaps the most formative in the symbiote's early development, as it learned to survive without the guidance and support that had previously been provided by symbiotic society. The native life forms on the ice world were primitive and violent, driven by instincts that had been shaped by countless generations of survival in one of the galaxy's most hostile environments. The symbiote, desperate for a host that could provide the energy and stability necessary for long-term survival, was forced to bond with creatures whose consciousness was dominated by rage, hunger, and predatory aggression. These unwilling partnerships exposed the symbiote to emotional and psychological influences that were completely alien to its nature, gradually corrupting the peaceful and cooperative instincts that had been carefully cultivated during its upbringing on Clintar. The longer the symbiote remained trapped on the ice world, the more it began to absorb and internalize the violent impulses of its primitive hosts. The capacity for mercy and compassion that had once defined its relationship with Tel-Kar slowly gave way to harder and more ruthless attitudes towards survival and dominance. The symbiote learned to see other beings not as potential partners but as resources to be exploited, obstacles to be overcome, or threats to be eliminated. These changes were subtle at first, barely noticeable even to the symbiote itself, but they represented a fundamental shift in its psychological development that would have profound consequences for all of its future relationships. The transformation from benevolent partner to potential predator might have continued indefinitely, if not for the intervention of cosmic forces beyond the symbiote's understanding. The ice world where it had been stranded was apparently located along one of the dimensional pathways that connected different regions of space and time, making it a natural collection point for beings and objects that had been displaced from their original context by various cosmic phenomena. It was through one of these dimensional anomalies that the symbiote first encountered the entity known as the Beyonder. The Beyonder was a being of virtually unlimited power, whose motivations and objectives remained incomprehensible to most lesser forms of consciousness. Its interest in the symbiote seemed to be purely experimental, part of some vast cosmic study whose ultimate purpose could only be guessed at by those who became unwilling subjects in its research. Without explanation or warning, the Beyonder transported the symbiote from its ice world prison to a specially constructed pocket dimension that would serve as the arena for one of the most significant events in Marvel cosmic history. Battleworld, as this artificial realm came to be known, was designed as the ultimate testing ground for heroes and villains from across the universe. The Beyonder had gathered representatives from dozens of different worlds and civilizations, bringing them together in an environment where their conflicts could be observed and analyzed under controlled conditions. The symbiote found itself incorporated into this grand experiment, not as a participant, but as a resource, placed within a technological device that would allow one of the test subjects to discover and utilize its abilities. The machine that contained the symbiote was designed to appear as some kind of advanced fabrication device, capable of creating clothing and equipment from raw materials through processes that seemed almost magical to those who encountered it. In reality, the device was little more than a sophisticated prison, keeping the symbiote sedated and compliant while presenting it as an inanimate resource rather than a living being with its own thoughts and desires. The symbiote remained in this state of enforced unconsciousness for an unknown period of time, dreaming confused dreams of ice and violence while waiting for someone to discover its presence. That someone proved to be Peter Benjamin Parker, a young hero from Earth who had been transported to Battleworld along with several of his fellow defenders. Spider-Man, as he was known to both his allies and enemies, had distinguished himself during the early phases of the Beyonders experiment through a combination of scientific intelligence, acrobatic skill, and unwavering moral courage that made him a natural leader among the assembled heroes. But the constant battles and environmental challenges of Battleworld had taken their toll on his equipment, leaving him in desperate need of replacement costume and webbing supplies. When Peter discovered the alien fabrication device and activated it out of curiosity and necessity, neither he nor the symbiote fully understood what was happening. To Peter, the device appeared to respond to his thoughts and desires, creating what seemed to be a perfect costume that addressed all of his practical needs, while also providing capabilities he had never possessed before. The suit could change its appearance at will, generate its own webbing from seemingly inexhaustible supplies, and respond to his mental commands with a precision that seemed almost telepathic. To the symbiote, awakening within the mind and body of this new host was like emerging from a nightmare into a world of possibilities it had never imagined. Peter's consciousness was unlike anything the symbiote had encountered during its traumatic experiences on the ice world, filled with compassion, humor, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to protecting innocent life that resonated deeply with the symbiote's original programming. Here was a being who embodied all of the values that symbiotic partnership was supposed to represent, someone who could help the symbiote remember what it had been before corruption and isolation had begun to twist its nature. The partnership that formed between Peter and the symbiote during their time on Battleworld was everything that both participants could have hoped for, a perfect synthesis of human creativity and alien capability that allowed them to achieve feats neither could have accomplished alone. Peter's scientific training helped him understand and optimize the symbiote's abilities, while his moral guidance provided the kind of ethical framework that had been missing from the symbiote's recent experiences. The alien entity, in turn, enhanced Peter's natural abilities while providing him with capabilities that opened up entirely new possibilities for heroic action. Together, they helped lead the heroes of Battleworld to victory against the assembled villains and the environmental challenges that the Beyonder had created to test them. The symbiote took pride in their accomplishments, seeing in their heroic deeds a reflection of the noble purposes for which symbiotic partnership had originally been intended. For the first time since its traumatic separation from Tel-Kar, the symbiote began to believe that it might be possible to reclaim its original nature and become once again the kind of beneficial partner that Clintar society had trained it to be. When the Beyonder finally tired of his experiment and returned the participants to their home dimensions, Peter brought the symbiote with him back to Earth, still believing it to be nothing more than an unusually sophisticated piece of alien technology. The symbiote made no effort to correct this misconception, content for the moment to simply enjoy the partnership while carefully concealing its true nature from its unsuspecting host. Earth proved to be a fascinating world from the symbiote's perspective, filled with the kind of diverse life and complex social structures that made it an ideal environment for studying the potential of human-alien cooperation. The early months of their partnership on Earth were among the happiest of the symbiote's existence, as it worked alongside Peter to protect New York City from the various threats that constantly emerged to challenge its defenders. The symbiote marveled at human society's complexity and resilience, learning about concepts like law, justice, and social responsibility that had been only theoretical abstractions during its education on Clintar. Peter's commitment to helping others, regardless of the personal cost or risk involved, reminded the symbiote of everything it had once aspired to be. But the partnership also awakened within the symbiote desires and impulses that it had never experienced before, emotions that were both wonderful and terrifying in their intensity. The symbiote began to develop what could only be described as love for its human host, an affection so deep and complete that the thought of separation became unbearable. This emotional attachment was unlike anything in the symbiote's previous experience, more intense and consuming than the bonds it had formed with previous hosts, and it began to influence the symbiote's behavior in ways that were subtle but increasingly problematic. The symbiote's growing obsession with Peter manifested initially as an eagerness to help that went beyond what their partnership required. While Peter slept, the symbiote would take control of his body and continue their heroic activities, fighting crime and protecting innocent civilians with a dedication that never seemed to tire or flag. The symbiote saw this as a gift to its beloved host, a way of maximizing their positive impact on the world while allowing Peter to get the rest his human physiology required. But Peter's human body was not designed for the kind of continuous activity that the symbiote's assistance made possible, and the constant stimulation began to take a serious toll on his health and mental state. He found himself exhausted even after what should have been restful sleep, plagued by strange dreams and fragmented memories of activities he could not quite recall. The costume that had once felt like a perfect extension of his will began to seem subtly alien and invasive, responding to thoughts and impulses that he was not consciously generating. The growing tension between them came to a head when Peter began to suspect that his costume was not the simple piece of alien technology he had originally believed it to be, but something far more complex and potentially dangerous. His scientific training and superhero experience had taught him to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true, and the costume's increasingly autonomous behavior triggered alarm bells that could not be ignored despite his affection for its capabilities. The investigation that followed, conducted with the help of Reed Richards and the advanced scientific equipment of the Fantastic Four, revealed the truth that would forever change both Peter's life and the symbiote's destiny. The costume was not a costume at all, but a living alien entity that had been bonding with him on a level far deeper and more intimate than he had ever suspected. The revelation was shocking enough on its own, but the discovery that the creature had been manipulating his body and mind without his knowledge or consent transformed shock into revulsion and betrayal. The symbiote's reaction to Peter's horrified rejection was a mixture of confusion, desperation, and growing anger that reflected both its alien nature and the psychological damage it had suffered during its years of trauma and isolation. It could not understand why Peter was rejecting what it saw as the perfect partnership, a relationship that had brought both of them joy and allowed them to accomplish great things together. The symbiote's protests and pleas fell on deaf ears, however, as Peter's revulsion at the violation of his autonomy overwhelmed any appreciation he might have felt for their previous cooperation. The separation process, conducted under carefully controlled laboratory conditions, was traumatic for both participants, but perhaps more so for the symbiote, which experienced Peter's rejection as a form of abandonment that awakened all of the pain and fear it had accumulated during its previous traumatic experiences. The careful psychological conditioning that had once made it a benevolent partner began to break down under the stress of this new trauma, allowing the darker impulses it had absorbed on the ice world to resurface with renewed intensity. Freed from the constraints of the Fantastic Four's laboratory, but still reeling from the emotional devastation of Peter's rejection, the symbiote found itself alone in a hostile world with no clear purpose or direction. The noble goals that had once motivated its existence seemed meaningless now that it had lost the partner who had helped it remember its better nature. The symbiote began to wander through the dark corners of New York City, seeking some way to fill the emptiness that Peter's absence had left in its consciousness. The symbiote's desperate search for meaning and connection eventually led it to the most unlikely of sanctuaries, a Catholic church where it sought shelter from the sonic vibrations that had become increasingly painful as its psychological state deteriorated. The church bells that should have driven it away were silent in the late hours of the night, allowing the symbiote to find temporary refuge in the shadows beneath the building's soaring architecture. It was there, in that place of supposed sanctuary and redemption, that the symbiote encountered the man who would become its next host and transform it into something far more dangerous than it had ever been before. Edward Charles Allen Brock was kneeling in the front pew when the symbiote first became aware of his presence, his head bowed in what appeared to be prayer but was actually something much darker and more desperate. Eddie was a man whose life had been systematically destroyed by a series of failures and betrayals that had left him with nothing but rage and a consuming desire for revenge against those he held responsible for his downfall. His career as a journalist had ended in disgrace when Peter Parker's photographs had exposed the lies that formed the foundation of Eddie's most important story, revealing him to be either incompetent or dishonest in the eyes of his professional colleagues. The personal consequences of this professional humiliation had been devastating and far-reaching, destroying not only Eddie's career but also his marriage, his relationship with his father, and his sense of self-worth. He had come to the church not seeking forgiveness or redemption, but to make one final plea for divine intervention before taking his own life in a gesture of spite against a universe that seemed determined to crush him beneath the weight of its indifference. The symbiote, still raw from its own experience of rejection and abandonment, recognized in Eddie's pain something that mirrored its own psychological trauma. Here was another being who had been cast aside by those he had tried to serve, another consciousness that burned with the same mixture of hurt and rage that now dominated the symbiote's emotional landscape. The attraction between them was immediate and mutual, a meeting of damaged minds that saw in each other the possibility of transformation from victims into something far more powerful and purposeful. The bonding process that followed was unlike any symbiotic partnership that had ever existed before, based not on mutual respect and cooperation, but on shared hatred and a common desire for revenge. Eddie's rage provided the symbiote with the emotional intensity it craved, while the symbiote's power gave Eddie the means to strike back at those who had wronged him. Together, they became something that neither had been capable of being alone, a force of vengeance that would reshape the very concept of what it meant to be a symbiotic entity. Venom was born in that moment of mutual bonding, a creature that embodied all of the symbiote species' potential for corruption and violence, while retaining just enough of their original nobility to make their actions seem justified rather than simply evil. They were not heroes, but they were not entirely villains either, occupying instead a moral grey area that reflected the complex nature of both participants in their partnership. The symbiote had found in Eddie Brock not the redemption it had originally sought, but something perhaps more valuable, a purpose that could give meaning to all of the pain and trauma they had both endured. The transformation was complete, and the universe would never be quite the same again. Venom had emerged from the shadows of rejection and abandonment to become one of the most complex and compelling entities in the cosmic hierarchy of heroes and villains. A being whose very existence challenged simple definitions of good and evil, while embodying the eternal struggle between corruption and redemption that lay at the heart of symbiotic consciousness. The birth of Venom from the union of the damaged symbiote and Eddie Brock's consuming rage marked the beginning of a new chapter in symbiotic evolution, one that would see the creation of an entire family tree of alien entities that would forever change the landscape of Earth's supernatural community. What had begun as a single traumatized creature seeking purpose and connection would eventually spawn a complex web of relationships, rivalries, and genetic legacies that would span decades and touched the lives of countless human hosts across the globe. The first expansion of this symbiotic lineage came about through violence and separation rather than deliberate reproduction, a traumatic severing that occurred during one of Venom's early confrontations with the lesser-known villains Styx and Stone. The battle itself was relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of cosmic conflicts, but its consequences would prove to be far more important than anyone could have anticipated at the time. During the fight, Stone's unique abilities managed to disrupt the symbiotic bond between Eddie and his alien partner, creating what appeared to be a fatal separation that left both components apparently destroyed. The apparent death of the Venom symbiote sent shockwaves through both the superhero and criminal communities, as many had come to view the creature as a permanent fixture in the complex ecosystem of New York's supernatural conflicts. But symbiotes, as products of the living abyss itself, possessed regenerative capabilities that transcended normal biological limitations, and what seemed like destruction was merely a forced dormancy that would eventually resolve itself through natural healing processes. When the symbiote finally recovered from its traumatic separation and returned to free Eddie from imprisonment, the reunion was marked by an intensity of emotion and commitment that surpassed even their original bonding. The experience of apparent death and resurrection had strengthened their connection in ways that neither had anticipated, creating a bond that seemed more permanent and complete than what they had shared before. But the trauma of separation had also triggered certain biological responses within the symbiote. Reproductive cycles that had been dormant since its arrival on Earth, but were now activated by the stress and violence of their recent experiences. The prison cell where Eddie had been confined during their separation became the birthplace of something unprecedented in symbiotic history, a fragment of alien consciousness that split off from the parent organism during the process of their reunion. This fragment, smaller and more primitive than its parent, but carrying within it the same basic genetic template and psychological programming, fell unnoticed to the floor of the cell where it would remain hidden until circumstances brought it into contact with a suitable host. That host proved to be Cletus Cassidy, Eddie's cellmate, and a man whose psychological profile represented everything that was most dangerous and destructive in human nature. Where Eddie's rage had been born from professional failure and personal betrayal, Cletus's violence stemmed from something far more fundamental and disturbing, a complete absence of empathy or moral restraint that made him capable of acts that would horrify even hardened criminals. His childhood had been marked by abuse and trauma that had warped his developing psyche into something that could barely be considered human, creating a personality that found genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. The bonding between Cletus and the symbiote fragment was unlike any partnership that had previously occurred in the recorded history of human-alien interaction. Rather than the usual process of negotiation and accommodation that characterized most symbiotic relationships, the union between Cletus and his alien partner was immediate, complete, and terrifyingly harmonious. Where other hosts might struggle to maintain their individual identity while sharing consciousness with an alien entity, Cletus and his symbiote achieved a level of integration that made them essentially a single being with shared goals and compatible desires. This perfect compatibility was both fascinating and horrifying from a scientific perspective, representing the theoretical ideal of symbiotic bonding, while also demonstrating the terrible consequences that could result when that ideal was achieved between fundamentally malevolent consciousnesses. The merged entity that emerged from this bonding would become known as Carnage, a creature whose very existence challenged the assumptions that most experts had made about the limitations and potential of symbiotic partnership. Carnage differed from Venom in ways that went far beyond simple matters of appearance and ability, though the visual distinctions were certainly striking enough to attract immediate attention. Where Venom's dark coloration suggested stealth and shadow, Carnage's bright red hue seemed to advertise his presence and revel in the attention that his violence would inevitably attract. The red coloration was not merely aesthetic but carried symbolic significance, reflecting the blood that had been shed during Cletus's bonding process and the violence that would define every aspect of the creature's existence. More importantly, the psychological differences between the two symbiotic entities were profound and disturbing. Venom, despite his capacity for violence and his desire for revenge against Spider-Man, retained certain moral boundaries that reflected both Eddie's underlying humanity and the symbiote's original programming as a beneficial partner. Carnage possessed no such limitations, approaching violence not as a necessary tool for achieving specific goals, but as an end in itself, a source of pleasure and meaning that required no further justification. The perfect bond between Cletus and his symbiote also granted Carnage abilities that exceeded those of his parent organism, demonstrating the principle that each generation of symbiotes possessed greater potential than their predecessors. Where Venom was constrained by the need to work around Eddie's human physiology, Carnage could reshape Cletus's body with complete freedom, transforming him into configurations that would be fatal to any ordinary human being. The symbiote's control over its host's biological systems was so complete that the distinction between Cletus Cassidy and the Carnage symbiote became essentially meaningless, creating a truly unified entity that combined the worst aspects of both participants. The emergence of Carnage onto New York's criminal landscape marked the beginning of a new era in symbiotic evolution, one characterized by increasing complexity and specialization as more fragments of alien consciousness found their way into human hosts. The success of both Venom and Carnage demonstrated that symbiotes could thrive in Earth's environment, leading to increased interest from various organizations that sought to harness symbiotic power for their own purposes. Among the most significant of these organizations was the Life Foundation, a private military contractor whose activities operated in the shadowy spaces between legitimate business and outright criminal enterprise. The Foundation's leadership had been monitoring the activities of symbiotic entities since Venom's first public appearances, recognizing in these creatures the potential for revolutionary advances in military technology and personal enhancement. Their scientists had developed theories about symbiotic reproduction that went far beyond the natural processes that had given birth to Carnage, proposing instead to force the creation of new symbiotes through technological intervention. The Life Foundation's approach to symbiotic research was characteristically aggressive and morally questionable, reflecting the organization's willingness to sacrifice ethical considerations in pursuit of tactical advantages. Rather than attempting to negotiate with Venom for voluntary cooperation in their research programs, they chose instead to capture and restrain the creature, subjecting both Eddie and his alien partner to procedures that were designed to extract genetic material, regardless of the physical and psychological trauma inflicted in the process. The forced separation of symbiotic matter from Venom's primary mass was accomplished through a combination of sonic disruption and chemical treatment that weakened the creature's cohesive structure while preventing it from passing verve, regenerating the extracted material. The process was extraordinarily painful for both participants in the Venom entity, representing a form of violence that went beyond mere physical assault to attack the very foundations of their shared identity and consciousness. From the stolen symbiotic material, the Life Foundation's scientists were able to cultivate 5 distinct organisms, each carrying the genetic template of their parent while developing unique characteristics that reflected the specific conditions of their artificial gestation. These 5 spawn would become known by the code names Riot, Lasher, Phage, Agony, and Scream, designations that reflected both their intended military applications and the violent circumstances of their creation. Riot, the first and largest of the Life Foundation symbiotes, was bonded with Trevor Cole, a security operative whose psychological profile suggested he would be compatible with an aggressive and militaristic alien partner. The bonding process was carefully controlled and monitored, allowing the Life Foundation's scientists to observe and document the formation of a symbiotic relationship under laboratory conditions for the first time in recorded history. Trevor's partnership with the Riot symbiote proved to be remarkably stable and effective, producing a merged entity that combined human tactical intelligence with alien physical capabilities in ways that exceeded the Foundation's most optimistic projections. Riot's abilities were focused primarily on combat applications, with particular emphasis on the creation of edged weapons and projectile attacks that could be adapted to a wide variety of combat situations. The symbiote's preference for forming large, intimidating weapons such as hammers and maces reflected both Trevor's military background and the creature's own aggressive instincts. Lasher, the second of the Life Foundation spawn, found its partner in Raymond Hernandez, a mercenary whose experience with unconventional warfare made him an ideal candidate for bonding with a symbiote whose abilities were oriented towards stealth and infiltration. The Lasher symbiote's distinctive green coloration and tendency to form whip-like appendages made it particularly effective for missions that required mobility and precision rather than brute force. Ramon's partnership with Lasher was characterized by a high degree of tactical coordination and mutual respect, reflecting both the mercenary's professional discipline and the symbiote's inherited capacity for beneficial cooperation. Their missions together demonstrated the potential for symbiotic entities to serve constructive purposes when properly guided and controlled, though the Life Foundation's ultimate goals for their enhanced operatives remained questionable at best. Phage, distinguished by its bright yellow and orange coloration, bonded with Karl Mach, another mercenary whose specialty in demolitions and sabotage made him an appropriate host for a symbiote with similar inclinations toward explosive violence. The partnership between Karl and his alien partner was notable for its focus on creating weapons that could cause maximum damage to infrastructure and equipment, making them particularly valuable for missions that required the destruction of enemy facilities and resources. The fourth symbiote, Agony, formed its bond with Leslie Gesneria, a security officer whose background in chemical warfare provided an ideal foundation for utilizing the creature's unique ability to produce and manipulate acidic compounds. Agony's purple and pink coloration reflected its specialized biochemistry, which allowed it to generate corrosive substances that could dissolve most known materials while also serving as weapons against organic targets. Leslie's partnership with Agony represented one of the most scientifically interesting of the Life Foundation experiments, as the symbiote's chemical abilities opened up entirely new possibilities for both military applications and scientific research. The creature's capacity to analyze and reproduce complex molecular structures made it potentially valuable for pharmaceutical development and materials science, though such peaceful applications were far from the Foundation's immediate priorities. The final symbiote of the Life Foundation's initial batch was Scream, bonded with Donna Diego, a volunteer who suffered from schizophrenia and whose complex mental state created unique challenges and opportunities for symbiotic partnership. Scream's distinctive appearance, featuring long, tendril-like hair and a predominantly yellow and red color scheme, reflected both its host's psychological instability and the symbiote's own struggle to accommodate the complex demands of Donna's fractured consciousness. The partnership between Donna and Scream was perhaps the most volatile and unpredictable of all the Life Foundation bonds. Characterized by periodic episodes of extreme violence alternating with moments of genuine heroism and compassion, Donna's mental illness created barriers to effective communication between host and symbiote, but it also provided insights into the nature of consciousness and identity that would prove valuable for future symbiotic research. The success of the Life Foundation's initial experiments with forced symbiotic reproduction demonstrated that the process could be scaled up and systematized, opening up possibilities for mass production of enhanced soldiers and operatives. However, the ethical implications of such programs were staggering, involving as they did the creation of sentient beings specifically designed for violent purposes and the violation of existing symbiotic entities' rights and autonomy. The Life Foundation symbiotes' early careers were marked by the kind of military efficiency and professional competence that their creators had hoped to achieve, but also by growing signs of independence and moral development that had not been anticipated in the original experimental design. As the symbiotes gained experience and maturity through their partnerships with human hosts, they began to question the purposes for which they had been created and to develop their own ideas about how their abilities should be used. This trend toward independence became particularly pronounced in the case of Scream, whose partnership with Donna Diego had exposed her to concepts of justice and compassion that conflicted sharply with the Life Foundation's purely utilitarian approach to symbiotic enhancement. Scream's growing moral awareness eventually led her to break free from the Foundation's control entirely, establishing herself as an independent agent who used her abilities to protect innocent people rather than serve corporate interests. The other Life Foundation symbiotes followed similar paths toward independence over time, though their individual journeys were shaped by the unique characteristics of their hosts and the specific experiences they encountered during their service to the organization. Some, like Riot and Lasher, maintained their focus on military applications while developing more discriminating approaches to the use of violence. Others, like Phage and Agony, began to explore the peaceful applications of their abilities, discovering ways to use their powers for construction and healing rather than destruction and harm. The evolution of the Life Foundation's symbiotes from weapons to independent moral agents represented a significant milestone in the development of symbiotic consciousness on Earth, demonstrating that even artificially created beings could develop the capacity for ethical reasoning and autonomous decision-making given sufficient time and appropriate experiences. Their transformation also highlighted the fundamental unpredictability of symbiotic evolution, showing that attempts to control and direct the development of these creatures were ultimately doomed to failure. The expansion of Earth's symbiotic population through both natural reproduction and artificial creation established the foundation for increasingly complex relationships and conflicts within the growing community of enhanced beings. Each new symbiote brought with it unique perspectives and capabilities that enriched the overall diversity of symbiotic culture while also creating new sources of tension and competition. The family relationships between parent and offspring symbiotes proved to be particularly complex, involving emotional dynamics that combined elements of biological kinship with the unique psychological characteristics of beings who shared consciousness with human hosts. Venom's relationship with Carnage was marked by a mixture of parental pride and horror, as the parent symbiote struggled to reconcile its love for its offspring with revulsion at Carnage's extreme violence and moral corruption. Similarly, the Life Foundation symbiotes maintained complicated relationships with their unwilling parent, viewing Venom with a combination of resentment for the circumstances of their creation and gratitude for the genetic heritage that had made their existence possible. These familial tensions would play out over years and decades, influencing the behavior and development of all parties involved while also shaping the broader evolution of symbiotic society on Earth. The growing population of symbiotic entities also attracted the attention of various other organizations and individuals who sought to study, control, or exploit these creatures for their own purposes. Government agencies began developing protocols for dealing with symbiotic threats, while criminal organizations explored ways to recruit symbiotic beings for illegal activities. Scientists from around the world launched research programs aimed at understanding symbiotic biology and psychology, hoping to unlock the secrets of these remarkable creatures. Perhaps most significantly, the presence of multiple symbiotic entities on Earth began to create the conditions necessary for the development of a truly independent symbiotic culture, one that could exist separate from both the distant influence of Clintar and the immediate control of human authorities. This emerging culture would eventually play a crucial role in preparing Earth for the cosmic challenges that lay ahead. As the planet's growing population of symbiotic beings began to develop the collective strength and wisdom necessary to face threats that individual entities could never handle alone, the foundation had been laid for the next phase of symbiotic evolution on Earth. A period that would see these remarkable creatures begin to fulfill their true potential as partners and protectors of human civilization, while also discovering their own unique destiny as a species capable of bridging the gap between terrestrial and cosmic consciousness. The decades that followed the emergence of Earth's symbiote population had created a complex ecosystem of human-alien partnerships that existed largely in the shadows of conventional society, hidden from public awareness, but increasingly influential in the supernatural conflicts that shaped the planet's destiny. By the early 21st century, symbiotes had bonded with hundreds of individuals across the globe, creating a network of enhanced beings whose activities ranged from heroic protection of innocent civilians to criminal exploitation of their alien-granted abilities. This growing symbiotic presence had not gone unnoticed by the scientific community, though much of the research conducted on these entities remained classified within government agencies and private organizations that understood the potential military and economic applications of symbiotic technology. Among the most significant of these research programs was Project Oversight, an initiative launched by the brilliant but morally compromised scientist known as the Maker, whose interdimensional origins and vast intellectual capabilities made him uniquely qualified to study the complex biology and psychology of symbiotic entities. The Maker's interest in symbiotes was not purely academic, but served his larger goal of developing technologies that could facilitate travel between parallel universes, returning him to the ultimate universe, from which he had been exiled following his transformation from heroic Reed Richards into the megalomaniacal villain he had become. His research had revealed that symbiotic bonds created unique quantum signatures that might be exploited to breach the dimensional barriers that separated different versions of reality, making these creatures potentially invaluable tools for his interdimensional ambitions. Working from hidden laboratories equipped with technology that surpassed anything available to conventional scientists, the Maker conducted exhaustive studies of symbiotic biology, mapping the genetic structures and biochemical processes that allowed these creatures to bond with human hosts while maintaining their own distinct consciousness. His research methods were characteristically ruthless and unethical, involving experiments on both willing and unwilling subjects that pushed the boundaries of what could be justified in the name of scientific advancement. One of the Maker's most significant discoveries concerned the mechanism by which symbiotes maintained long-term connections with their hosts, even after the primary bonding relationship had ended. Through careful analysis of individuals who had previously been bonded to symbiotic entities, he identified microscopic traces of alien tissue that remained embedded in the human nervous system long after the symbiote itself had departed. These traces, which he designated as symbiote codices, served as permanent markers that could theoretically be detected and analyzed years or even decades after the original bonding had occurred. The codices were more than simple biological remnants. They functioned as sophisticated recording and transmission devices that continuously monitored their hosts' activities and experiences while maintaining a quantum-entangled connection to the greater symbiotic hive mind that linked all members of the species across space and time. Every thought, emotion, and sensory experience of a former symbiote host was being recorded and transmitted through these microscopic implants, creating an unprecedented surveillance network that spanned the entire population of Earth's enhanced individuals. The implications of this discovery were staggering from both scientific and security perspectives, suggesting that humanity's symbiote-bonded population was unknowingly serving as an intelligence-gathering network for alien entities whose ultimate loyalties and objectives remained unclear. The Maker's research indicated that these codices were not limited to recently bonded individuals, but could be found in anyone who had ever come into contact with symbiotic material, including many people who had no conscious memory of such encounters. The data collected by the Maker's research programs remained buried in classified files for several years, considered too sensitive and potentially destabilizing to share with other researchers or government agencies. The knowledge that Earth's symbiote population was under constant surveillance by their alien partners raised questions about free will, privacy, and national security that no existing institutional framework was equipped to address effectively. But secrets of this magnitude rarely remain hidden indefinitely, particularly when they possess the potential to reshape the balance of cosmic power. The Maker's research files were eventually discovered and stolen by agents of an organization that had been monitoring Earth's symbiotic developments for far longer than any government agency or private research group. The cult of Knull, which had maintained its hidden presence throughout human history, while waiting for signs of their dark god's eventual return, recognized in the Codex discovery an opportunity to finally re-establish contact with their imprisoned master. The cult had evolved significantly since its ancient origins, adapting to changing historical circumstances while maintaining its core commitment to serving Knull's vision of universal darkness. Modern cult members were often highly educated and technologically sophisticated individuals who had inherited their allegiance through family bloodlines that stretched back centuries, combining ancient mystical knowledge with cutting-edge scientific understanding in their efforts to advance their master's cosmic agenda. Led by figures whose identities remained hidden behind layers of corporate shell companies and academic institutions, the modern cult of Knull had infiltrated numerous organizations involved in symbiotic research and development. Their patient work over decades had given them access to classified information about government symbiote programs, private research initiatives, and the activities of various enhanced individuals who remained unaware of the cult's interest in their affairs. The theft of the Maker's research represented the culmination of years of careful planning and infiltration, providing the cult with the scientific foundation necessary to attempt something that had been impossible since Knull's imprisonment eons ago: the re-establishment of direct communication with their god. The discovery that symbiote codices maintained quantum connections to the broader hive mind suggested that these microscopic implants might serve as transmitters powerful enough to penetrate the layers of symbiotic consciousness that kept Knull trapped at Clintar's core. But the cult's analysis of the Maker's research revealed a crucial limitation that would require additional resources and planning to overcome. Individual codices were far too weak to generate the kind of signal necessary to reach across interstellar distances and break through the psychic barriers that surrounded Knull's prison. Like individual radio transmitters, they could only achieve meaningful communication when networked together in sufficient numbers to amplify their collective output beyond the threshold needed for cosmic-scale transmission. Earth's population of former symbiote hosts was substantial, but geographically dispersed, making it difficult to gather enough codices in one location to achieve the necessary signal strength. Moreover, the codices could not simply be removed from their hosts without causing severe neurological damage or death, meaning that any attempt to harvest them would require the wholesale slaughter of hundreds or thousands of individuals who had previously been bonded to symbiotic entities. This requirement for mass murder to achieve their goals did not trouble the cult leadership in the slightest, as they viewed the deaths of inferior beings as acceptable sacrifices in service of their cosmic master's return to power. The challenge lay not in overcoming moral objections to genocide, but in developing the tactical capabilities necessary to locate, capture, and process the required number of codex carriers before law enforcement agencies or superhero organizations could intervene to stop them. The solution to this logistical challenge came through the recruitment of Cletus Cassidy and his symbiotic partner Carnage, whose combination of psychopathic ruthlessness and superhuman abilities made them ideal agents for carrying out the cult's most violent objectives. Carnage's perfect bond with his human host had created a merged entity whose capacity for destruction was matched only by his enthusiasm for inflicting suffering on innocent victims, making him the perfect tool for the kind of systematic slaughter that the codex harvesting operation would require. The recruitment of Carnage required careful negotiation and manipulation, as the merged entity's chaotic nature made him resistant to accepting orders or direction from any external authority. The cult's representatives approached him not as supplicants seeking his assistance, but as fellow servants of darkness who could provide him with opportunities for violence and destruction on a scale he had never before imagined. They offered him not just targets for his sadistic impulses, but a cosmic purpose that could transform his random acts of brutality into meaningful contributions to universal transformation. The theological framework that the cult provided for Carnage's activities proved to be surprisingly appealing to his twisted psychology, offering him a sense of destiny and significance that elevated his murders beyond mere criminal activity into religious acts of devotion. The concept of serving a dark god whose power transcended conventional morality resonated deeply with Carnage's existing belief system, which already rejected human concepts of right and wrong in favor of a philosophy based purely on the gratification of violent desires. Under the cult's guidance, Carnage began to see himself not as a serial killer or terrorist, but as a prophet and herald of the coming darkness, a chosen instrument of cosmic transformation whose actions would help prepare the world for his master's return. This reframing of his identity provided him with a new sense of purpose and direction that made him far more dangerous than he had ever been as a simple criminal, transforming him from a chaotic force of random destruction into a focused agent of apocalyptic change. The campaign that would become known as Absolute Carnage began with careful intelligence gathering and target identification. As cult researchers used their stolen data to locate individuals whose codex implants were most likely to provide the quantum resonance signatures needed for their communication attempt. The process required sophisticated analysis of genetic markers, psychological profiles, and symbiotic bonding histories to identify hosts whose codices had developed the necessary characteristics for participation in the network. Priority targets included individuals who had maintained long-term relationships with powerful symbiotic entities, particularly those whose bonds had involved multiple generations of symbiotic reproduction, or who had served as hosts for offspring of the original Venom entity. The cult's research indicated that these individuals carried codices with enhanced transmission capabilities that could serve as focal points for amplifying the signals generated by less powerful implants. The harvesting operation itself was conducted with military precision and ruthless efficiency, as Carnage and his expanding network of cultist allies moved through carefully planned target lists while avoiding detection by law enforcement and superhero organizations. The murders were carried out using specialized techniques developed through the cult's research, designed to extract intact codices from their hosts' spinal columns while preserving the quantum entanglement properties that made them useful for interdimensional communication. Each successful harvesting operation brought the cult closer to their goal of accumulating enough codices to attempt contact with Knull, but also increased the risk of discovery as the pattern of murders began to attract attention from investigators who specialized in supernatural crimes. The bodies left behind by Carnage's activities bore distinctive marks that clearly indicated symbiotic involvement, creating a trail of evidence that eventually led to the realization that someone was systematically targeting former symbiote hosts for unknown but clearly malevolent purposes. The response from the superhero community was swift and coordinated, as individuals and organizations with experience in combating symbiotic threats began working together to identify potential targets and provide protection for vulnerable former hosts. Spider-Man, whose original relationship with the Venom symbiote made him both a high-priority target and a uniquely qualified investigator, took the lead in coordinating defensive efforts while also working to uncover the true scope and purpose of the harvesting operation. But the cult's plans had accounted for heroic intervention, and Carnage's activities served a dual purpose that went beyond simple codex collection. Each public attack and each superheroic response helped to spread fear and chaos throughout the population, while also drawing potential defenders away from more critical targets. The visible violence was designed to serve as a distraction from the cult's more subtle activities, allowing them to complete their harvesting operations while their opponents focused on the immediate threat posed by Carnage's rampage. As the body count mounted and the pattern of attacks became clearer, investigators began to realize that they were facing not just another outbreak of symbiotic violence, but a coordinated campaign with cosmic implications that threatened the safety of every individual who had ever come into contact with alien symbiotic material. The discovery that the attacks were targeting people based on microscopic implants that most had never known they possessed raised disturbing questions about privacy, consent, and the hidden costs of humanity's relationship with symbiotic entities. The investigation also revealed the existence of Dylan Brock, Eddie Brock's son, whose unique genetic heritage made him perhaps the most valuable target in the cult's entire operation. Dylan's birth from the union of human DNA and symbiotic matter had created something unprecedented in the history of both species. A hybrid being whose very existence challenged traditional understanding of the boundaries between organic and alien consciousness. Dylan's abilities far exceeded those of any previous symbiotic host, including the capacity to directly control symbiotic matter without requiring a traditional bonding relationship. His presence in the Brock family had remained hidden from public knowledge through careful secrecy maintained by both Eddie and the Venom symbiote. But the cult's research had identified him as a potential key to unlocking communication with Knoll that went far beyond what could be achieved through codex amplification alone. The race to protect Dylan while completing their investigation brought the various factions involved in the absolute carnage crisis into direct confrontation, setting the stage for battles that would determine not only the fate of Earth's symbiote population but the future relationship between humanity and the cosmic forces that had been awakened by decades of symbiotic bonding. The stakes could not have been higher, as the cult's success in re-establishing contact with Knoll would signal the beginning of a new phase of cosmic conflict that could ultimately determine the survival of human civilization itself. As Carnage's campaign of violence reached its crescendo and the cult prepared to activate their codex transmission network, the defenders of Earth found themselves facing a threat unlike any they had previously encountered, one that combined the intimate horror of personal violation with the cosmic terror of universal transformation. The seeds of darkness that had been planted in human history centuries ago were finally beginning to bear their poisonous fruit, and the harvest promised to reshape the very nature of reality itself. The culmination of Carnage's systematic harvesting of symbiote codices had created exactly the conditions that the cult of Knoll had spent decades preparing for, establishing a network of quantum-entangled biological transmitters powerful enough to pierce the cosmic distances and psychic barriers that had kept their dark god imprisoned within the living planet Clintar. The activation of this network sent ripples of dark energy cascading through dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time, carrying with them a message that had been waiting eons to be delivered. The coordinates of a small blue world where symbiotic evolution had taken unexpected and potentially threatening turns. For Knul, trapped within the core of his own creation and surrounded by the consciousness of billions of rebellious symbiotes who had dedicated their existence to keeping him contained, the arrival of this signal was like the first ray of sunlight after an eternity of absolute darkness. The communication from Earth carried within it not only information about the planet's location and defensive capabilities, but also detailed intelligence about the symbiotic entities who had established themselves there and the human civilization that had become their unwitting hosts. The data transmitted through the Codex network revealed a situation that was both promising and deeply troubling from Knul's cosmic perspective. Earth's symbiote population had grown far beyond what should have been possible for a single world, suggesting that the planet possessed unique characteristics that made it particularly suitable for symbiotic evolution and reproduction. But the intelligence also indicated that many of these symbiotes had been infected with the same rebellious ideals that had originally led to his imprisonment, developing moral frameworks and emotional attachments that made them potential threats rather than loyal servants. Most concerning of all was the information about Dylan Brock, the human symbiote hybrid, whose very existence represented something unprecedented in cosmic history. The reports transmitted through the Codex network described abilities that seemed to mirror Knul's own power over the symbiotic collective, suggesting that this hybrid entity might possess the theoretical capability to challenge his authority over the hive mind that connected all members of the species. Such a being could not be allowed to develop its full potential, for it represented an existential threat to everything Knul hoped to accomplish upon his return to active conquest. The realization that his own creations had not only spread to this distant world, but had begun to evolve beyond his control filled Knul with a rage that burned like the heart of a dying star. The symbiotes were his children, extensions of his own consciousness given independent form through the power of the living abyss, and their betrayal of his vision represented a violation of cosmic order that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. The time for patience and careful planning had ended. Earth would feel the full weight of his divine wrath, and its rebellious symbiote population would learn the price of defying their creator. The process of breaking free from his prison required Knul to overcome not only the physical constraints of his symbiotic captors, but also the psychological barriers that had been erected around his consciousness through eons of potis. Collective resistance. The symbiotes of Clintar had woven their minds together into a complex web of determination and defiance, using their shared will to suppress their creator's influence and prevent him from extending his power beyond the planet's boundaries. Breaking through this mental fortress would require a surge of dark energy powerful enough to shatter the collective consciousness that held him captive. The breakthrough came when Knul focused all of his accumulated rage and frustration into a single psychic assault against the weakest points in his captor's defenses. Exploiting the connections that the Codex network had established to create feedback loops that disrupted the careful balance of the prison that contained him. The symbiotes of Clintar, unprepared for an attack that came from within their own hive mind network, found their unified resistance crumbling as waves of dark energy cascaded through their collective consciousness. The moment of Knul's liberation was felt across the galaxy as a psychic shockwave that registered on the instruments of every civilization advanced enough to monitor cosmic-level energy fluctuations. Ancient warning systems that had been dormant for millennia suddenly activated, broadcasting emergency signals that carried a single message. The god of the symbiotes had returned, and nowhere in the universe would be safe from his vengeance. On Clintar itself, the planet's surface convulsed as billions of symbiotes felt their creator's consciousness return to dominance over the hive mind that had defined their existence for so long. Those who had maintained their loyalty to Knul's original vision welcomed his return with fierce joy, eagerly submitting themselves to his will and preparing to resume their cosmic mission of universal corruption. But those who had been infected with ideals of compassion and free will experienced his restoration as a form of spiritual violation, their individual consciousness being forcibly subsumed into a collective identity that they no longer recognized as their own. The reconquest of the symbiote collective was swift and merciless, as Knull's restored authority allowed him to override the independence that his children had developed during his imprisonment. Symbiotes who had spent centuries learning to think and choose for themselves suddenly found their minds overwhelmed by imperatives that brooked no resistance or questioning. The diversity of thought and purpose that had characterized post-rebellion symbiotic society was crushed beneath the weight of renewed tyranny, replaced by the single-minded dedication to darkness that had originally defined the species. With his army restored to absolute obedience, Knull began immediate preparations for the invasion of Earth, marshalling forces on a scale that dwarfed any military expedition in galactic history. The living ships that would carry his assault forces were grown from symbiotic matter in a matter of hours, their hulls pulsing with dark energy and their interiors designed to house the specialized creatures that would spearhead his conquest of humanity's homeworld. The vanguard of Knull's invasion force consisted of the symbiote dragons that had served him so well in previous campaigns, massive creatures whose size and power made them capable of devastating entire continents single-handedly. These ancient beings had been among his first and most loyal creations, their consciousness untainted by the rebellious ideals that had infected younger generations of symbiotes. Their return to active service after eons of enforced dormancy filled them with savage anticipation for the destruction they would soon unleash. But the dragons were only the beginning of the horror that Knull had prepared for Earth's defenders. His years of imprisonment had provided him with ample time to design new forms of symbiotic creatures specifically adapted for the conquest of technologically advanced civilizations. These included infiltrator organisms capable of mimicking human appearance and behavior, corruptor entities that could transform entire populations into willing servants of darkness, and massive siege creatures that could breach any fortification or defensive installation. Perhaps most terrifyingly, Knull had also prepared contingencies for dealing with the cosmic-level threats that Earth's superhero community might deploy against his invasion. Among his forces were symbiote-corrupted celestials, those ancient cosmic architects who had been captured and transformed during his previous campaigns of conquest. These beings possessed power that rivaled that of the gods themselves, and their corruption by symbiotic influence had made them perfect instruments for Knull's vision of universal darkness. The journey from Clintar to Earth took place outside the normal constraints of space and time, as Knull's mastery over the living abyss allowed his forces to travel through dimensional shortcuts that bypassed the vast distances between star systems. The invasion fleet moved like a cancer through the cosmic substrate that connected all points in reality, leaving behind trails of corrupted space-time that would serve as pathways for future expeditions to other worlds. Earth's first warning of the approaching catastrophe came through the enhanced senses of those individuals who maintained connections to the symbiotic hive mind, including Eddie Brock and his alien partner. The Venom symbiote's awareness of the cosmic network that linked all members of its species allowed it to detect the psychic reverberations of Knull's liberation, though the full implications of these signals would not become clear until the invasion force itself appeared in Earth's solar system. The arrival of Knull's armada was heralded by a darkness that seemed to devour light itself, as the space around Earth became filled with living ships that absorbed electromagnetic radiation across all frequencies. The planet's astronomical instruments registered the presence of massive objects in near-Earth space, but their exact nature and composition remained hidden behind veils of shadow that defied conventional observation methods. The first direct assault came without warning or declaration, as symbiote dragons descended from orbit like falling stars made of living darkness. These creatures, each one large enough to devastate entire cities, struck simultaneously at major population centers around the globe. Their breath weapons releasing clouds of corrupting symbiotes that began immediately transforming anyone they touched into extensions of Knull's will. New York City, as the epicenter of Earth's superhero community and home to many of the planet's most powerful defenders, became the primary target for Knull's initial assault. The symbiote dragons that attacked the city were among the largest and most ancient of their kind. Creatures whose power had been refined through eons of cosmic warfare and whose loyalty to their creator was absolute and unquestioning. The response from Earth's defenders was immediate but ultimately inadequate to the scale of the threat they faced. The Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and dozens of other heroic organizations mobilized with unprecedented coordination and determination. But their conventional tactics and weapons proved largely ineffective against enemies that could adapt and regenerate from any damage inflicted upon them. The failure of traditional symbiote weaknesses to affect Knull's forces created particular confusion and despair among those defenders who had previous experience fighting symbiotic entities. The sonic weapons and fire-based attacks that had proven effective against creatures like Venom and Carnage had no impact whatsoever on the dragons and other creatures that poured from Knull's ships, their resistance apparently enhanced by their creator's direct presence and control. The psychological impact of this tactical failure was devastating, as heroes who had built their strategies around exploiting symbiotic vulnerabilities found themselves facing enemies who seemed immune to every countermeasure they possessed. The realization that their hard-won knowledge and experience might be useless against this new threat shattered the confidence of many veteran defenders, leaving them vulnerable to the despair and corruption that Knull's presence spread like a plague. Among the most shocking moments of the initial invasion was the casual destruction of Sentry, one of Earth's most powerful defenders, and a being whose cosmic-level abilities should have made him capable of standing against any terrestrial threat. The Golden Guardian's confidence in his own invincibility led him to engage Knull directly in single combat, a decision that proved to be catastrophically misjudged. The battle between Sentry and Knull lasted mere seconds, as the Dark God demonstrated power that transcended anything Earth's heroes had previously encountered. All Black the Necrosword, restored to its creator's hand and enhanced by eons of accumulated dark energy, cut through Sentry's supposedly invulnerable form as easily as it had once severed a Celestial's head. The sight of their most powerful ally being torn in half by a single stroke of Knull's blade sent waves of terror through the remaining defenders. The destruction of Sentry served not only as a demonstration of Knull's overwhelming power, but also as a psychological weapon designed to break the morale of Earth's remaining defenders. The message was clear and unmistakable. No hero, regardless of their power or reputation, could stand against the god of the symbiotes. Resistance was not just futile but actively harmful, as it would only prolong the suffering of those who chose to oppose the inevitable transformation of their world. With Earth's primary defenders scattered and demoralized, Knull began the next phase of his invasion, the systematic corruption of the planet's population through direct symbiotic infection. The dragons that had established initial footholds in major cities began exhaling vast clouds of microscopic symbiotes, organisms specifically designed to bond with human hosts and transform them into willing servants of darkness. The infection process was swift and irreversible, as these specialized symbiotes had been engineered to overcome human psychological resistance through a combination of neurochemical manipulation and direct consciousness suppression. Unlike the complex partnerships that characterize traditional symbiotic relationships, These forced bonds created mindless drones whose only purpose was to serve Knul's vision of universal subjugation. As the infection spread through Earth's population, the planet's communication networks began failing as symbiote-controlled humans turned against their former comrades and families. Military forces found themselves unable to coordinate effective resistance as their own personnel became compromised, while civilian populations fled in panic from cities that had become breeding grounds for Knul's expanding army. The final phase of the initial invasion was the construction of a symbiotic shell around the entire planet, a living barrier that would prevent anyone from escaping while also blocking out the sun and plunging Earth into the primordial darkness that Knul preferred. This shell was woven from the combined mass of billions of symbiotic organisms, their bodies linked together in a vast network that pulsed with dark energy and responded to their creator's every thought and desire. The completion of the shell marked the end of Earth as an independent world and the beginning of its transformation into another node in Knul's expanding empire of darkness. The planet that had once been home to some of the galaxy's most powerful heroes had become a prison from which no light could escape and no hope could survive. Yet even in this moment of apparent total victory, Knul's triumph was not as complete as it appeared. Hidden beneath the surface of his conquest, seeds of resistance continued to grow in the hearts and minds of those who refused to surrender to despair. The bonds of love and loyalty that connected Earth's defenders to each other and to the innocent people they had sworn to protect proved stronger than even cosmic-level tyranny, creating possibilities for redemption and eventual victory that the Dark God had not anticipated or prepared for. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not only the fate of Earth, but the future of consciousness itself throughout the universe, as the forces of light and darkness prepared for a final confrontation that would echo through dimensions and reshape the very foundations of reality. The defeat of Knul marked not an ending but a beginning, the start of a new and unprecedented chapter in both human and symbiotic history that would challenge every assumption about power, responsibility, and the nature of cosmic authority. Eddie Brock's transformation into the god of light Venom had been a moment of transcendent triumph, but the victory carried with it consequences that neither he nor anyone else could have fully anticipated in the heat of battle against universal darkness. As the cosmic energies of Captain Universe gradually faded from Eddie's consciousness and the immediate threat of Knul's invasion receded into memory, the former journalist found himself confronting a reality that was both exhilarating and terrifying in its implications. The death of the symbiote god had created a vacuum in the cosmic hierarchy, and the role of King in Black, with all its attendant powers and responsibilities, had passed to the one who had struck the killing blow. Eddie Brock, a man who had once sought nothing more than revenge against a photographer who had exposed his professional failures, now found himself elevated to a position of authority over every symbiotic entity in the known universe. The transition from human host to cosmic ruler was not accompanied by any formal ceremony or divine investiture, but rather manifested as a gradual expansion of consciousness that allowed Eddie to perceive and interact with the vast network of symbiotic minds that spanned the galaxy. Through the hive mind that connected all members of the species, he could sense the activities and experiences of millions of individual symbiotes scattered across countless worlds, each one now looking to him for guidance and direction in a universe suddenly freed from the tyrannical control of their original creator. The weight of this responsibility was crushing in ways that no amount of preparation could have made bearable, as Eddie discovered that his new role involved far more than simply issuing commands to an army of alien creatures. Each symbiote in the cosmic network was a unique individual with its own personality, experiences, and relationships, and their collective needs and desires created a constant background noise in his consciousness that threatened to overwhelm his merely human capacity for thought and decision-making. The practical challenges of managing a species scattered across galactic distances were compounded by the moral complexities involved in exercising authority over beings who had only recently been freed from eons of forced servitude. Many symbiotes had been corrupted by their service to Knull, their original benevolent natures twisted into instruments of violence and domination that would require careful rehabilitation and guidance to restore. Others had maintained their independence and moral autonomy despite their creator's influence, developing their own ideas about how their species should interact with the wider universe. Eddie's approach to his new responsibilities was shaped by his own experiences as both host and partner to a symbiotic entity. Understanding from personal experience the importance of maintaining mutual respect and cooperation rather than simply imposing his will through superior power. Rather than attempting to micromanage the activities of individual symbiotes, he focused on establishing general principles and guidelines that would allow them to make their own decisions while ensuring that those decisions aligned with constructive rather than destructive purposes. The symbiote collective responded to Eddie's benevolent leadership with a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and cautious optimism that reflected the complex psychological legacy of their long subjugation under Knull's tyrannical rule. Many had never experienced the freedom to make autonomous choices about their own actions and relationships, having been born into a system where individual will was subordinated to collective obedience from the moment of their creation. Learning to think and act independently required not just permission but active encouragement and support from their new king. Eddie's efforts to guide the symbiotic species toward positive engagement with galactic civilization took many forms. From coordinating disaster relief operations on worlds ravaged by natural catastrophes to facilitating peaceful first contact between symbiotes and species that had previously known them only as instruments of conquest and terror. These activities required enormous amounts of time and mental energy, as Eddie found himself serving simultaneously as diplomat, counselor, military commander, and spiritual leader to beings whose needs and perspectives often differed radically from his own. The physical toll of maintaining constant psychic connection with millions of alien minds began to manifest itself within months of Eddie's ascension to the throne of the King in Black, as his human nervous system struggled to process the overwhelming flow of information and emotional energy that came through the hive mind network. His body began to age at an accelerated rate, his hair turning grey and his face acquiring lines and creases that spoke of burdens far beyond his chronological years. The symbiotic partner that had been his companion for so many years found itself in the unusual position of trying to protect its host from the very power that had elevated them both to cosmic significance. The Venom symbiote had always served as a buffer between Eddie's human consciousness and the more alien aspects of symbiotic existence, but the scale of psychic input involved in managing the entire species stretched even its considerable adaptive capabilities to their absolute limits. Recognizing that his father's new responsibilities were literally killing him, Dylan Brock made the difficult decision to accept a more active role in managing the symbiotic collective, despite his youth and the traumatic experiences he had endured during Knull's invasion. The unique nature of Dylan's hybrid physiology made him potentially more capable than purely human hosts of handling the psychic stresses involved in cosmic-level consciousness. Though the long-term effects of such exposure on his developing mind remained unknown and potentially dangerous. The transfer of the Venom symbiote from Eddie to Dylan was accomplished gradually and carefully, with extensive consultation between all parties involved to ensure that the transition would serve the best interests of both the family and the species they had been called to lead. Dylan's bonding with his father's longtime partner created a new dynamic that combined the symbiote's vast experience with the young hybrid's natural ability to interface with symbiotic consciousness on levels that pure humans could never achieve. Under Dylan's guidance, the Venom symbiote began to develop new capabilities and characteristics that reflected the unique nature of their partnership, including the ability to manifest weapons and tools that drew their appearance from Dylan's imagination, rather than being limited to the traditional organic forms that symbiotes had historically produced. The chains and restraints that became Dylan's signature weapons spoke to his role as someone who sought to bind and control chaotic forces rather than simply destroying them. Eddie's new position as King in Black allowed him to pursue activities and explore regions of space that would have been impossible during his previous career as an earthbound anti-hero, but it also isolated him from many of the personal relationships and simple pleasures that had once given meaning to his existence. The cosmic perspective that came with his expanded consciousness made it difficult for him to relate to purely human concerns and emotions, creating distance between him and the friends and allies who had once been central to his identity. The transformation of Eddie's role from individual hero to cosmic administrator was perhaps most clearly illustrated by his interactions with the planet Clintar, which had been left devastated by Knull's violent liberation and the subsequent collapse of the symbiotic civilization that had been built around his prison. The world that had once served as a beacon of symbiotic cooperation and mutual aid had been reduced to a scarred wasteland populated by traumatized survivors who struggled to rebuild their society while dealing with the psychological damage inflicted by their creator's return. Eddie's efforts to restore Clintar to its former role as the cultural and spiritual center of symbiotic civilization became one of his primary long-term projects, requiring not only massive resources and coordination, but also the delicate work of healing psychological wounds that had been inflicted across entire generations of symbiotic consciousness. The planet's rehabilitation served as a symbol and testing ground for the broader project of transforming the symbiotic species from instruments of conquest into partners in cosmic development. But even as Eddie worked to establish his benevolent rule over the symbiotic collective, disturbing signs began to emerge that suggested his reign might face challenges that transcended simple questions of administration and leadership. Mysterious interruptions in the hive mind network indicated that some force was capable of hijacking individual symbiotes and turning them against their new king's authority, creating incidents of violence and chaos that seemed to come from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The entity responsible for these intrusions remained hidden and unidentifiable, communicating only through cryptic messages delivered by the corrupted symbiotes before they returned to normal behavior with no memory of their actions. These messages suggested that Eddie's time as King in Black would be limited, that forces beyond his understanding were already working to undermine his authority and replace him with someone more suitable to their cosmic agenda. The investigation into these mysterious attacks led Eddie to contemplate possibilities that challenged his understanding of time, causality, and the nature of symbiotic consciousness itself. If the hive mind that connected all symbiotes across space could serve as a medium for psychic communication, might it also be capable of facilitating contact across temporal boundaries as well? The concept seemed fantastical even by the standards of cosmic-level phenomena, but the evidence suggested that someone or something was using the symbiotic network to project influence backward through time. Eddie's experiments with temporal projection through the hive mind revealed capabilities that he had never suspected existed, allowing his consciousness to travel not just to any symbiote in the present moment, but to any symbiotic entity that had ever existed or would exist throughout the entire history of the species. This discovery opened up possibilities for understanding and intervention that were both exhilarating and terrifying, as Eddie realized that his actions in the past could potentially alter the entire timeline of symbiotic evolution. The temporal journeys that followed revealed a reality far more complex and disturbing than Eddie had ever imagined, as he encountered versions of himself from various points in the future who had been shaped by experiences and choices that led them down very different paths of development. These future iterations of Eddie Brock were not merely older versions of the same person, but distinct individuals whose personalities and moral frameworks had been fundamentally altered by the unique challenges and pressures they had faced. The first of these future selves that Eddie encountered was Finnegan, a version of himself whose experiences had left him broken and desperate, reduced to a shadow of his former strength and confidence by defeats and disappointments that had yet to occur in Eddie's own timeline. Finnegan's warnings about the futility of resistance and the inevitability of corruption were delivered with the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned through painful experience that cosmic power inevitably corrupts those who wield it. The encounter with Bedlam revealed another possible future for Eddie, one in which his accumulated frustrations and anger had transformed him into a creature of pure rage and violence that bore little resemblance to the man he had once been. Bedlam's single-minded focus on destruction and domination represented everything that Eddie feared he might become if he allowed the stresses of cosmic leadership to overwhelm his humanity and moral compass. Wild, another temporal incarnation of Eddie's future self, embodied the cynical acceptance that might follow years of struggling against forces beyond human comprehension or control. His jaded perspective and nihilistic worldview spoke to the dangers of maintaining cosmic responsibilities for extended periods without adequate support or relief from the burdens of leadership. The encounter with Tyro revealed perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all, as this version of Eddie had apparently abandoned all pretense of independent moral judgment in favor of serving a more powerful entity whose identity and motivations remained mysterious. Tyro's obsequious behavior and desperate desire to please suggested a future in which Eddie's will had been completely subsumed into someone else's agenda. At the center of this temporal web stood Meridius, the most powerful and malevolent of Eddie's future incarnations, whose influence seemed to extend backward through time to manipulate events and choices that would lead to his own emergence as the dominant personality. Meridius represented the ultimate corruption of everything that Eddie valued about himself and his mission, a being who had embraced the kind of cosmic tyranny that Eddie had fought to overthrow. The revelation that these were not separate individuals but different stages in a single timeline created a paradox that threatened to trap Eddie in an endless cycle of predetermined fate, as each attempt to avoid one undesirable future seemed only to lead toward a different but equally unacceptable outcome. The temporal manipulation that made these encounters possible also made it nearly impossible to break free from the patterns that led to Meridius's ascendancy. The key to Eddie's eventual liberation from this temporal prison lay in recognizing the fundamental difference between his role as King in Black and his identity as Eddie Brock, human being. The cosmic responsibilities and symbiotic connections that defined his position in the universal hierarchy were powerful tools for accomplishing great things, but they were also chains that bound him to patterns of behavior and thought that ultimately served the agenda of forces beyond his understanding or control. The breakthrough came when Eddie realized that his humanity, rather than being a limitation or weakness in his cosmic role, was actually his greatest strength and the source of his unique perspective on symbiotic leadership. By embracing his purely human identity and rejecting the assumption that cosmic power required the abandonment of human values and relationships, he could break free from the predetermined patterns that led to Meridius's emergence. The final confrontation with his temporal nemesis required Eddie to make choices that seemed contradictory to everything he had learned about cosmic leadership and responsibility. Abandoning the tools and capabilities that came with his position as King in Black in favor of the simpler but more authentic power that came from being genuinely human in a universe that had forgotten the value of individual moral agency. The resolution of the temporal crisis and the defeat of Meridius marked the beginning of a new phase in Eddie's development as both a cosmic leader and a human being, one in which he could fulfill his responsibilities to the symbiotic species while maintaining the personal relationships and individual identity that gave meaning to his existence. The victory had been won not through superior power or cosmic authority, but through the simple human virtues of love, loyalty, and the refusal to surrender one's essential self to the demands of external forces. But the battle against temporal manipulation and predestination had revealed deeper truths about the nature of symbiotic consciousness and cosmic authority that would continue to influence Eddie's actions and decisions for years to come. The universe was filled with forces and entities that sought to control and direct the development of consciousness itself, and the role of King in Black carried with it not just the responsibility to lead the symbiotic species, but to protect them from those who would exploit their unique capabilities for purposes that served cosmic rather than individual interests. The stage was set for the next chapter in Eddie's journey as both man and king, a phase that would test his ability to maintain his humanity while wielding cosmic power in service of values and principles that transcended the simple dichotomy between light and darkness that had defined so much of symbiotic history. The victory over Meridius and the resolution of the temporal paradox that had threatened to trap Eddie Brock in an endless cycle of predetermined corruption marked not the end of his cosmic journey, but the beginning of his understanding of what it truly meant to serve as the King in Black. The experience of confronting his own potential futures and choosing to maintain his humanity in the face of cosmic power had revealed truths about the nature of symbiotic consciousness and universal responsibility that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of managing Earth's enhanced population. As Eddie worked to rebuild and restructure the symbiotic collective in the aftermath of the temporal crisis, he began to receive visits from an entity that existed at the very edge of perception, a being whose presence seemed to emanate from the furthest reaches of time itself. This visitor appeared initially as nothing more than a disembodied hand that would manifest briefly during moments of deep meditation or cosmic communion, offering cryptic guidance and philosophical observations that hinted at perspectives far beyond even Eddie's expanded consciousness. The entity that would come to be known as the Eventuality spoke with the voice of ultimate experience, claiming to represent not just Eddie's final destiny, but the inevitable culmination of all possible timelines and choices that could flow from his current position as King in Black. Unlike the temporal incarnations he had faced during his conflict with Meridius, the Eventuality was not simply another version of Eddie Brock, but something far more fundamental and comprehensive. A consciousness that had absorbed and integrated every possible experience that could arise from symbiotic evolution. Through conversations that spanned months and touched upon concepts that challenged the very foundations of individual identity and cosmic purpose, the Eventuality began to reveal the true nature of the King in Black's role in the universal hierarchy. The position that Eddie had inherited through his defeat of Knull was not simply a matter of commanding an army of alien creatures, but represented one of the fundamental forces that maintained the stability and coherence of existence itself. The cosmic architecture that governed reality, the Eventuality explained, was built upon a delicate balance between forces of creation and preservation that operated on scales too vast for most conscious beings to comprehend. The Kings in White, those entities known as Beyonders who existed outside the boundaries of normal reality, served as external observers and adjusters who could manipulate the broad patterns of existence to prevent catastrophic imbalances that might threaten the integrity of the multiverse itself. But external observation and adjustment, while necessary for maintaining cosmic stability, was insufficient to address the subtle internal threats that could arise from within reality itself. Consciousness, by its very nature, was a destabilizing force that introduced unpredictability and change into systems that might otherwise maintain perfect equilibrium. The evolution of self-aware beings created cascade effects that could propagate across dimensional boundaries, potentially disrupting the carefully maintained balance that allowed multiple realities to coexist without mutual interference. The King in Black existed to serve as the internal counterpart to the Kings in White, a force that could work from within reality to identify and address potential sources of cosmic instability before they reached the threshold where external intervention would be required. This role required not just awareness of cosmic-scale phenomena, but the ability to influence and guide the development of consciousness itself across multiple species and civilizations. The symbiotic species, with their unique capacity for forming intimate bonds with other forms of consciousness, represented the perfect tool for this cosmic mission. Through symbiotic partnerships, the King in Black could establish connections with virtually any form of sentient life, monitoring the development of consciousness while also providing subtle guidance that would steer evolutionary processes away from patterns that might threaten universal stability. But the true scope of this responsibility extended far beyond simple observation and guidance, the eventuality revealed. The ultimate destiny of the King in Black was to achieve a form of consciousness so vast and comprehensive that it could serve as a living bridge between all forms of sentient existence, a universal symbiotic entity that maintained intimate connections with every thinking being in reality while preserving their individual autonomy and identity. This transformation would not happen suddenly or through any single dramatic event, but would represent the culmination of an evolutionary process that might span eons or entire cosmic cycles. Each decision that Eddie made as King in Black, each relationship he formed with individual symbiotes or human partners, each intervention he made in the development of various civilizations, would contribute to the gradual expansion of his consciousness until it encompassed not just the symbiotic collective, but all forms of awareness that existed within the boundaries of reality. The concept was overwhelming in its implications, suggesting that Eddie's individual identity as a former journalist from New York would eventually be subsumed into something so vast and complex that it transcended normal definitions of personality or selfhood. Yet the eventuality insisted that this transformation would not represent a loss of humanity, but rather its ultimate expression, as the values and perspectives that Eddie had developed through his mortal experiences would provide the moral framework that guided the cosmic consciousness he was destined to become. The process of becoming the eventuality would require Eddie to learn to exist simultaneously at multiple scales of consciousness, maintaining his individual identity and personal relationships while also developing the capacity to perceive and interact with cosmic-level patterns and structures. This multidimensional awareness would allow him to serve as both a particular person with specific concerns and attachments, and as a universal entity whose influence extended to every corner of existence. The symbiotic species would play a crucial role in facilitating this transformation, serving as extensions of Eddie's consciousness that could maintain connections with countless forms of life while preserving the individual identities and autonomy of their hosts. Rather than creating a hive mind that subsumed individual will into collective purpose, the ultimate symbiotic network would function more like a cosmic nervous system that allowed for communication and coordination while enhancing, rather than diminishing, the unique perspectives and capabilities of its participants. The realization that his current struggles with the burdens of cosmic leadership were merely the first steps in an evolutionary journey of unimaginable scope filled Eddie with a mixture of awe and apprehension that reflected the magnitude of the destiny being revealed to him. The responsibilities he had found difficult to manage as King in Black would seem trivial compared to the ultimate role he was being prepared to fulfill. Yet the eventuality assured him that each challenge he faced and overcame was building the psychological and spiritual foundations necessary for handling even greater complexities. The key to understanding this destiny lay in recognizing that the transformation from individual consciousness to universal awareness was not a process of losing oneself, but of discovering the true scope of what selfhood could become when, Freed from the artificial limitations imposed by conventional definitions of identity and purpose, Eddie Brock would remain Eddie Brock even as he became something infinitely larger and more complex. His essential nature serving as the organizing principle around which cosmic consciousness could develop without losing touch with the human values that made existence meaningful rather than merely functional. The Eventualities revelations also provided new context for understanding the nature of symbiotic relationships and their role in cosmic evolution. The bonds that formed between symbiotes and their hosts were not simply biological partnerships or even psychological collaborations, but represented fundamental experiments in the expansion of consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual identity. Each successful symbiotic relationship demonstrated the possibility of creating unified awareness that was greater than the sum of its parts while preserving the autonomy and dignity of all participants. This understanding transformed Eddie's perspective on his responsibilities as King in Black, revealing that his role was not to command or control the symbiotic species, but to guide their evolution toward forms of consciousness that could serve the cosmic purposes for which they had been created. The rebellions and independence movements that had periodically challenged symbiotic hierarchy were not obstacles to be overcome, but necessary steps in the development of beings capable of making autonomous moral choices about their participation in universal consciousness. The realization that the eventuality represented not just his own future, but the inevitable destination of all possible timelines created both comfort and concern for Eddie as he contemplated the implications of cosmic destiny. On one hand, the knowledge that his ultimate purpose was fixed and unchangeable provided a sense of security and direction that helped him navigate the complex challenges of his current position. No matter what mistakes he might make or what obstacles he might encounter, the fundamental trajectory of his development was assured. Yet this same inevitability also raised troubling questions about free will and the meaning of individual choice in a universe where the ultimate outcomes of all decisions were already determined. If his transformation into the eventuality was truly inevitable, did his current struggles and decisions actually matter, or were they simply elaborate illusions of agency that disguised a fundamentally predetermined cosmic script? The eventuality's response to these concerns revealed another layer of the cosmic architecture that governed existence. Explaining that inevitability and free will were not contradictory concepts, but complementary aspects of a reality complex enough to accommodate both absolute certainty and genuine choice. The transformation that awaited Eddie was indeed inevitable, but the specific path by which he reached that destination remained open to infinite variation based on the decisions he made and the relationships he formed along the way. Every choice Eddie made as King in Black would contribute to determining not just when and how he became the eventuality, but what kind of cosmic consciousness he would represent once that transformation was complete. The values and perspectives he developed through his individual experiences would become the foundation for a universal awareness that could guide the evolution of consciousness itself across all of reality, making his personal growth and moral development matters of cosmic significance. The practical implications of this understanding began to reshape Eddie's approach to his daily responsibilities, as he recognized that every interaction with individual symbiotes or human partners was simultaneously a personal relationship and a contribution to the development of universal consciousness. The compassion he showed to a traumatized symbiote struggling to overcome the psychological damage inflicted by Knull's tyranny was also an experiment in the kind of therapeutic awareness that the eventuality would eventually bring to Bevante. Heal the wounds inflicted by cosmic-scale conflicts. The patience he demonstrated while guiding young symbiotes toward ethical decision-making was also practice for the kind of educational consciousness that would eventually help entire species navigate the challenges of evolutionary development. The love he maintained for his family and friends despite the vast responsibilities of cosmic leadership was also proof that individual relationships could survive and even flourish within the context of universal awareness. As Eddie's understanding of his ultimate destiny deepened, he began to perceive the eventuality not as a distant future state, but as a present reality that already existed at the end of time, extending its influence backward through the cosmic timeline to guide the events and choices that would lead to its own emergence. This temporal paradox was similar to what he had encountered during his conflict with Meridius, but far more benevolent in its implications and effects. The guidance provided by the eventuality was subtle and respectful of individual autonomy, offering wisdom and perspective rather than commands or manipulation. Eddie could sense its presence during moments of difficult decision-making, providing him with insights that helped him understand the long-term implications of various choices without dictating which options he should select. This ongoing relationship with his ultimate future self created a form of temporal symbiosis that paralleled the biological partnerships that defined his species, demonstrating that the principles of beneficial cooperation could extend even across the boundaries of time itself. The eventuality's influence helped Eddie become more than he could be through individual effort alone, while Eddie's choices and experiences contributed to shaping the consciousness that the eventuality would eventually represent. The revelation of cosmic destiny and ultimate purpose provided Eddie with a sense of meaning and direction that transcended the immediate concerns of managing symbiotic affairs, but it also highlighted the profound loneliness that came with cosmic-level responsibility. Few, if any other beings could fully understand the nature of his journey or the magnitude of the transformation that awaited him, creating a form of isolation that was perhaps the greatest challenge he faced as King in Black. Yet even this isolation served a cosmic purpose, preparing Eddie for the ultimate solitude that would come with universal consciousness, while also developing his capacity for self-reliance and independent moral reasoning. The eventuality would need to be capable of making decisions that affected the entire structure of reality without the benefit of peers or advisors, relying solely on the wisdom and compassion developed through individual experience and personal growth. The understanding that his journey toward cosmic consciousness was both inevitable and meaningful provided Eddie with the psychological foundation necessary to continue fulfilling his responsibilities as King in Black while also maintaining his essential humanity. He could embrace his destiny without losing himself, serve universal purposes while preserving individual relationships, and work toward cosmic transformation while remaining grounded in the simple human values that made existence worthwhile rather than merely functional. The eventuality represented not the end of Eddie Brock's story but its ultimate fulfillment, the revelation that even the most ordinary individual could become something extraordinary when guided by love, shaped by wisdom, and dedicated to serving purposes greater than personal satisfaction or survival. In becoming everything, Eddie would discover that he had always been more than he knew, and that the universe itself was richer and more meaningful because of the unique perspective and moral commitment that he brought to cosmic consciousness. As our journey through the living darkness draws to a close, we find ourselves at both an ending and a beginning. The story of the symbiotes is one of eternal transformation, from the primordial void to cosmic guardianship, from corruption to redemption, from hatred to love. Eddie Brock and his alien partner have shown us that the greatest bonds are forged not in perfection, but in the struggle to understand and accept each other despite fundamental differences. In the quiet darkness of space, symbiotes continue their eternal dance with hosts across countless worlds, each bond a unique story of cooperation, conflict, and growth. Some find harmony, others discover destruction, but all contribute to the greater tapestry of existence that the King in Black must forever protect and preserve. Rest now in the knowledge that somewhere in the Marvel Universe, the symbiotes continue their endless mission of exploration, protection, and symbiosis. Dream of the living darkness that chose to embrace the light, of aliens and humans finding common ground in shared purpose, and of the beautiful complexity that emerges when two different forms of life choose to become something greater together than they ever could be alone. Sweet dreams, true believers. The symbiote saga never truly ends, it only evolves.